Beneath the sand of the Sahara there are lines that should not exist, vast geometric grids that shimmer beneath the endless sands of the Sahara. Something impossible lies hidden. Lines, straight, deliberate, geometric, forming vast grids that shimmer under satellite scans, like the ghostly remains of an ancient, forgotten world. Not a village, not a ruin, but something older, something designed, as if drawn by an engineer's hand, long before the first civilizations we've ever known. And thousands of miles away, deep beneath the waters of Japan, a diver's light falls upon a staircase carved in stone, each step flawless, descending into darkness. Two sites, two continents, one impossible question: who built these structures, and what ancient story have we buried beneath time itself? Welcome to the lost civilizations beneath our world, the forgotten civilization that vanished 97,000 years ago. Off India's western coast, stone blocks the size of cars lie stacked in precise formation, a city swallowed by the sea long before human civilization was supposed to exist at all. The official story says our ancestors were hunters, chipping flint and wandering in small tribes. Yet scattered across the planet are ruins carved with astronomical precision, maps that show ice-free continents, and myths that speak of gods and teachers who came before the flood. These fragments shouldn't fit together, and yet they do. Like pieces of a puzzle we were never meant to find. Scientists explain them away as coincidence, erosion, or imagination. But what if the real story of humanity didn't begin 6,000 years ago with Sumer or Egypt? What if instead it started over 100,000 years ago, with civilization so advanced it left behind no trace but stone and memory? A civilization wiped clean by a cataclysm that our oldest stories still whisper about. But first, before we begin exploring these lost ancient civilizations, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. Now, settle in, because tonight we follow the faint trail of evidence across oceans, deserts, and time itself to ask a question that has haunted explorers and skeptics alike. What if humanity has risen before and simply forgotten? A NASA technician leans closer to a dim console as the night shift stretches long and quiet. The room hums at a low, even pitch. On her screen, Sahara imagery sharpens, a grainy quilt of heat and sand turning crisp under different wavelengths. She slides a dial. Faint lines rise where the map should be chaotic. Grid meets grid, angles repeat, and a set of rectangles stacks out of the noise like ribs under skin. Her finger taps the glass. Dust storms should smear this view. Instead, something geometric holds steady beneath the dunes. She adjusts the radar layer and cool tones give way to earthy browns. A pale corridor cuts diagonally through the image, then forks, then braids. It looks like a river frozen in memory. She increases contrast. The corridor blossoms into a network of channels that feed into wide basins. The edges of these basins are clean, almost architectural. She presses a headset tighter to one ear. In the aftering of the lab's hum, she murmurs the old name geologists use for this drainage, Taman Rasset. The Taman Rasset river system once ran there, not a trickle, but a trunk stream that, in wetter ages, carved through green plains. Studies show it gathered tributaries across what is now desert, and poured them west into the Atlantic. Where there is a trunk, there are branches. Where there are branches, there is life. Those broad basins could have been inland lakes, some large enough to dwarf modern seas. The scan hints at shorelines wrapped with uniform bands that might be terraces, as if water level dropped in steps over time. The technician logs a timestamp. The cursor hovers over a straight line that shouldn't exist. Ground-penetrating radar tuned to sand's depth returns more than dead channels. In certain patches returns cluster into blocks, and blocks resolve into right angles. A scatter of dense points sits close to those angles set apart like beads. Heat signatures, once corrected, match patterns typical of hearths, carbon-rich zones centered in low depressions. Supporters suggest these arrays look like settlement grids, not the transient layouts of wandering camps. The alignments repeat over miles, always with the same spacing, always offset from the riverbed by a narrow margin, as if placed to avoid flood zones. Critics counter that geology can mimic order through stress and sediment. The patterns do not argue back. They repeat. The scan travels north and west. A spiral begins to occupy the frame and then it fills it. Concentric rings, clear as a thumbprint pressed into stone, circle a center raised barely above the rest. The Richer structure, the eye of the Sahara, shows its full design from the drone's height. Geologists describe it as uplift and erosion, a dome weathered into rings by time and wind. That reading fits many features. Others point to the neatness of its circles, the measured spacing, and whisper about a memory in Plato's story. A city of rings, water alternating with land. The technician tags the file with 2 words. Rishi verified. She doesn't write Atlantis. She doesn't need to. The video frames it without speech. When you follow the rain belts through deep time, the Sahara does not stay a desert. Climate models, including those developed in London, simulate monsoon patterns pushed north and south by slow cycles. In those green Sahara windows, this land grew tall grass, thorn trees, and wide wetlands. Some windows lasted only a few thousand years. Others, the models say, held steady for as long as 20 millennia. 20,000 years is enough time for grandmothers to teach granddaughters until a story becomes a law. It is also enough time for roads to settle into the earth and for stone to stack into walls that resist a passing tremor. The technician pulls up an old file tagged with a familiar name. Remote sensing methods, once aimed at Martian channels, have been turned earthward here. Under the dunes, log rectangles run true for startling distances, sometimes in parallel, sometimes crossing at predictable angles. They are too straight for rivers. They are too uniform for random cracks. The team calls them linears. Some measure a full kilometer before they fade. A field note attached to the dataset mentions rectangular shadows, the kind you see when a buried wall lies just below the surface and the sand thins over it in a breeze. You could miss them at noon. They stand out at dawn. A map overlays these linears on ancient hydrography. The rectangles cluster near the pale branches of Taman Reset. They also appear along a separate band that once would have been seasonal streams. Taken together, they look like planned corridors between water and upland. There is a regular spacing to the nodes where line meets line, as if junctions mattered to whoever drew them first. They are not roads in the modern sense, but they feel like intention. Some whisper about survey grids, or footprints of enclosure walls, or foundations for structures that left only their densest stones behind. Others dismiss the talk as pareidolia. The data sits quiet, waiting for the next pass. In field camps where the wind scratches tents at night, a different kind of evidence piles up. Radar points match ground truth in a handful of test pits where a dark band runs under the dune. A hand lifts a stone fragment that bears a flat face in a broken corner too sharp for the usual tumble. Near it, hearth ash compressed into a crumbly black layer contains burned seeds and tiny bones. Some alignments marked on the handheld GPS coordinate with the radar grids and point toward the same azimuth. A star the models say would have set differently then. The story that grows from these dots is not about a single village. It hints at a way of living that held to a pattern. The drone returns to the eye on a clear morning. The air thins and cools as altitude rises. More than rings emerge. The slopes between bands are scarred by channels that could be runoff paths, but a few lock in at intervals like terraces. On one flank, Dark streaks run along straight lines that parallel a ring but do not follow its curves. You could call them fractures. You could also call them walls. The clip runs twice. At the end, a small caption notes the debate. Geologic, anthropic, unresolved. Green Sahara periods did not simply arrive once and vanish forever. They pulsed. Between roughly 120,000 and 80,000 years ago, the models show a long, favorable stretch. The monsoon reached farther north. Lakes sat in basins now empty. A later pulse peaked around 10,000 years ago, leaving rock art of cattle, swimmers and boats on walls far from any water today. If you string those windows together, you get repeating invitations. The land opens, the rivers fill, people build. Then the sky shifts and the invitations end. Anyone who set routes here would have known both lushness and loss. A technician on the day shift pulls a fresh compile. He sits with coffee gone cold and watches the model play across time. The Sahara flickers between green and brown, bright and dull, alive and withdrawn. He toggles a layer labeled stability windows. Pale rectangles appear again, this time marking spans when rainfall variance drops, and stays low for thousands of years. In those spans, communities could standardize methods, perfect building habits, and trade along reliable routes. He draws a line between two pale blocks around 20,000 years. He writes a note in the margin, enough time to forget origins. Modern responses to this picture split in tone. In journals, phrases like geological coincidence and erosional pattern are common. The caution makes sense. Enthusiasm can outrun evidence. At the same time, it's not rare to hear a desert guide point to a ridge and say a word that means old wall. Explorers share coordinates of right angles snapped by drones at dawn, then trade them like fishermen trade secret coves. At some campfires, the quiet talk shifts to star maps that no longer match the sky, and markers that might have aligned with constellations erased by precession. The desert accepts both caution and rumor without comment. Another pass of infrared imaging washes the dunes with a heat ghost that flattens midday glare. Faint, straight traces brighten, thin as threads, and run across fields of otherwise random texture. Two run parallel for a while, then diverge at a fixed angle, then meet again in a diamond shape. These shapes repeat, offset like a tessellation. You could read them as water-to-sand boundaries etched by capillary action. You could also read them as plotting marks, the bones of something once mapped and built. The camera pulls back. Lines fade into an ocean of brown. In the midst of these scans, a set of coordinates lands on the technician's desk with a handwritten tag. She loads them. The location sits far from any marked oasis. The radar shows a cluster of hexagons nested into a large rosette, 30 miles across if the scale bar is right. Natural salt polygons can form such patterns at small scales. At this scale, the cell walls seem too straight. They also anchor to two long linears that run toward the old riverbeds. The file notes the possibility of a mineral lattice. It also marks a question. Why would a mineral lattice align to a vanished flow? Climate models built at University College London and elsewhere place a heavy emphasis on stability as a precondition for complex systems. A town can survive on chance. A region spanning hundreds of miles needs multi-generational planning and routes that hold their form. In the Sahara's long green spans, the atmosphere's rhythm provided that. Trade could move. Ideas could travel. Stone could be cut in one quarry and set in another, then tied to a third with an avenue that matched a shared standard. When the pulse withdrew, dunes unmade the surface grid. The subsurface remembers longer. On a field day near the eye's outer rings, a small team races a quadcopter at dawn. The air is cool, almost sweet with dust and a faint tang of metal from the drone. It lifts and banks over rings that glow in morning light. One pilot notes the shadow length on a straight run built into the ring's flank. Shadows can lie. they also reveal. The footage shows an alignment that follows a cardinal direction, as if drawn with a sightline. The geologic reed remains strong, but those crisp edges blur the border between landform and layout. The tension holds. Later, a sandstorm sweeps across a work area and sends grit under shirts and into teeth. The world turns to a tawny blur. Instruments go under canvas. The technician steps back inside, wipes dust from the lens and pulls up the thermal imaging feed. Through the heat haze, the straight traces still glow faintly under the surface, as if they kept their own weak ember. When the wind drops, the ground will look new again. On the screen, the grid remembers its old paths. The technician marks the segment and saves the frame. The day ends with a long pullback across dunes that run to the horizon and beyond. The scan shrinks to a small rectangle on a desk. The night crew signs on. A question hangs there with the same quiet weight as the image itself. If rivers once carved this place into gardens, and if grids once stitched those gardens together, how many other chapters lie beneath this patient sand, waiting for the next pass of a satellite to make their lines glow for a moment before the desert swallows them again? The desert exhales and the screen fades to black. For a heartbeat, there's only the sound of wind. Then it shifts, softens, turns liquid. The grains of sand become bubbles rising through green light. What once buried cities in silence now hides them beneath pressure and tide. The silence of the sand now slips into the rush of water. You're descending along a rope, breathing slowly through the regulator, watching a strip of seafloor brighten under your lamp. 20 feet down in the Arabian Sea, a hand meets an edge that shouldn't exist. It's a step, flat, right-angled, and worn at the lip where the coral has grown like frost on a window. The beam widens. Straight lines continue beyond the silt, making a grid where currents pulse through alleys no fish would choose by chance. Local crews point to sonar maps with hands still wet from the deck. Off India's coast, they've traced 9 square kilometers of walls, column bases and anchors shaped like heavy teardrops. The site sits under about 120 feet of water. Wood fragments raised from the seabed have come back with dates around 9,500 BCE. Supporters suggest the layout fits a planned harbor, roads, basins and mooring stones set in rows from a time when shorelines stretched farther out and the sea stood much lower than today. Critics counter that waves drag debris into patterns that fool the eye. Yet the grids keep showing up, not everywhere, in certain places that seem chosen. Here's the rub that makes the mind slow its step. Textbooks place the first steady farms and towns millennia later. In that older window, people carried wheat seed as a new idea, not a tradition. And still, right angles lie under the tide. If a coastal community built in stone while rivers ran wider across the shelf, then a rising ocean could hide it in a single lifetime. You can feel the tension in the deck boards as the sonar printer rattles out another pass, line after line resolving into streets under fish. Swim east, at least in your head, and you reach Yanaguni. A cliff of sandstone drops into blue, and at its edge sits a shape like a stepped terrace. Divers talk about corners crisp enough to catch a glove, and horizontal platforms that run like stacked floors. A marine geologist has paced those edges and logged 90-degree seams, even marks that look like chisel strokes under magnification. Others dismiss the whole thing as the rock doing what rock does, split along joints, shear into rectangles, and fool divers when light ripples and makes shadow sharp. You rise above the formation, and still it stacks like a ziggurat that drowned. Near the Yucatan Channel, a different story flickered across screens in 2001. Deep scans came back with images of complex forms where no reef should grow in straight lines. A grid appeared on the printout. Pyramidal shapes stood like dark tents in a field. The depth readout showed 2,000 feet of water above them. Engineers in the control room circled features with felt-tip pens and labeled avenues, walls, courtyards. Reports said of submersible sawstone faces and unexpected symbols. Then the story thinned in the news. The sea kept its own counsel, as it always does, but the map had already lodged in the mind. Regularity where chance should rule. All of this floats on a simple, cold fact. The water rose. After the last great ice sheets began to melt, sea levels climbed more than 120 meters. Not in a day, but fast enough to redraw coasts in the span of a tale told from grandparent to child. During the low stand, plains outflanked the continents. Rivers ran miles farther, carving into ground that is now a shelf of mud. If early people favored beaches and bays, warm fish, soft weather, easy travel, then much of their world lies under the line where lights glance green and ships drag nets. A known example sits closer to the modern eye. Doggerland connected Britain to Europe, a low plain of marsh and meadow. Fishermen's nets lift mammoth bones in brown salt and black peat, and sometimes they bring up stone blades or hearth charcoal. The land flooded as the seas climbed. It isn't a myth, it's mapped. When you hold a chipped point still sharp enough to cut damp rope, you understand how a continent can change shape while stories try to keep up. The point isn't that Doggerland was a city. It's that entire landscapes can vanish into gray water and wait there until a boat drags the past up by accident. Back in the Arabian Sea, the name Dvarka drifts through the boat cabin, not as proof, but as a thread. Sonar has traced walls. Divers have seen anchors sunk where boats would tie up, heavy stones with holes bored neatly through their centers. Carbon dates from wood dragged off the bottom come back around 9,500 BCE, give or take. Others caution that currents scatter, and the water's push makes patterns when none were planned. Still, when a diver's palm rests on a carved edge in green light, the skeptic's voice has to compete with the feel of straight stone under glove. The pattern repeats in faint echoes. In Japan, terrace steps meet the sea. In the Caribbean, a deep grid shows geometry without a builder's name. This isn't proof on its own. It's a cluster of notes in different keys that sound like a song if you let them overlap for a minute. Some whisper that long coasts once carried a chain of towns and ports, linked by small boats skimming a shoreline we don't see anymore. Others counter with geology. Rocks fracture, mud slumps. Sonar lies when silt layers fold into illusions. Both can be true in places. The mind holds both, and still the grid lines stay under the lamp. The physics of rising water doesn't care for our categories. During the cold maximum, Asia and North America touched by a broad land bridge. Coastlines bulged outward and then fell back. A beach village set in a good year might sit 5 miles offshore in a grandchild's old age. Boats rot, rope rots. Organic roofs melt into muck. Stone endures if it was used. It tends to sink into flat posture and weight. If you're searching for the earliest towns, looking inland may be like checking attic trunks when the ledger lies in the flooded basement below the stair. Modern tools can reach that basement, but only in short visits. Submersible drones map rectangles along trenches. Grids emerge and then blur as currents pluck the silt back into place. Grants run out. Permissions slow when borders meet water. Engineers shift their projects toward oil or cables. Meanwhile, the datasets grow old on hard drives, and the sea rolls on. The story doesn't die. It just sits patient like stone. That patience is a teacher. It asks what we call civilization when we use the word. Is it writing? A bronze blade? A kiln? Or is it people who carve a straight line, align a harbor and set anchors so a fleet can ride out a storm? If a coastal settlement knew the sky well enough to time fish runs and monsoons, it might track the tide on a stick and know more of cycles than a landlocked town with fresh wells. Some whisper that knowledge clung to memory as water took the tools. Others dismiss that as romance spread thin over rock. And still, the anchors sit where the old waterline would have been. You can chart numbers on a napkin with wet fingers. A 120-meter rise swallows a continental shelf that once held wide flats of grass and sand. That's not a narrow strip of beach. It's a nation's worth of room. If most people lived near the water for food and travel, then most traces of those people rest under waves. A fair share of what we call missing might only be hard to reach. There's a human beat to it in the cabin of a small boat. An operator thumbs the sonar gain up and down, searching for the level where noise drops and the lines hold. A diver swears softly when the visibility closes in with silt, then laughs when a crab walks across a perfect edge like a surveyor crossing a curb. The cook taps a spoon on a pot lid. This is how the past returns sometimes. With work, with small jokes, with waiting. Not with trumpets. With a hand on stone, curious echoes follow from another ocean. In the Cuban deep the scan lines that looked like avenues sparked requests, and then a hush when the work shifted elsewhere. A map in a drawer keeps an arrow pointing at a depth no scuba tank will ever touch. If those shapes prove natural, it won't make the question smaller. If they prove carved, it will stretch the shoreline of our story farther out than we have time to sail in one life. The sea level math doesn't need myth to feel large. In a few thousand years, an ocean can swallow a world that an elder could still describe by firelight. A trauma like that would ripple through names, calendars, and prayers. It would also leave practical marks, harbors without ships, anchors without ropes, stairs that lead down where streets once faced wind and sun. Doggerland's net finds remind us that the water's appetite is not rare. Mammoth bones and hearth coals rise in black clumps that smell of mineral and age, tools still cut. The people who warmed their hands over those fires were not a rumor. The bottom remembers. The cameras roll as a drone drifts over a Caribbean trench. Shapes that repeat. Rectangles, parallel pairs, right-angled corners appear in the murk for a minute and then recede into haze. A grant proposal waits for a signature that will fund another season. Politics flick their own currents across maps. You can feel the push and pull without saying a word about it. If 9 out of 10 early people hugged coasts for fish and gentle weather, then 9 out of 10 traces of their lives sit below the surge line. That ratio doesn't settle the argument about cities or farms. It nudges where we look. The story we tell about firsts may depend on what we can reach, not what was there. The diver's rope snaps softly against the hull as the last bubbles rise. Light from above slices into bars that shake with the waves. You start up slow, watching the carved step fade from touch and drift into green. The surface brightens until it flares white around the edge of your mask. The sea hisses as your head breaks through, and the boat leans toward you with a hand outstretched. Later on deck, the map and the memory sit side by side. Streets underwater. Grids where textbooks place woven baskets and crude huts. Maybe we invent, maybe we remember. The lens catches sunlight and throws a streak across the page as another swell lifts the bow, and the question that rises with it refuses to leave quietly. The crane's cable sings under strain, a bright steel note in the dry Lebanese air. The operator eases his lever, then lets it go slack. Below him, 3 pale blocks stretch along the terrace like parked ships, faces dead straight, edges crisp, each one weighing so much his machine may as well be a toy. He climbs down and rests a palm on the stone, warm from the sun, no give at all. The line of their placement is clean enough to throw a narrow shadow you could measure with a ruler at noon. Everyone on site knows the temples on top are Roman. The platform these giants form goes deeper. That's where the trouble starts. Baalbek's foundation sits like a solved equation whose steps have been erased. The later columns and pediments shout their age. The base doesn't. We can date mortar, quarry scars, tool styles. We struggle with bare stone placed at the scale, seated so tight that dust finds less purchase than a sheet of paper. Modern cranes can lift tons, even hundreds, but moving an 800-ton block, turning it, setting it flush so it bears load for centuries without creep. That's a different language. The puzzle isn't that someone did it, it's that we stand next to it and still can't diagram the verbs. Half a world away. The air thins, the sun sharpens, and the walls tilt like frozen waves. At Sacsayhuaman, the andesite bites back against the touch. You walk the line of the joints with a fingertip and feel the jigsaw switchbacks and notches. Interlocks within interlocks, a puzzle that refuses a straight cut. No mortar, no wiggle. Someone took Broken Mountain and made it behave like a single living object. Try to slide a blade between them. The steel finds nothing but its own edge. The cut faces bloom with tiny facets, as though the stones were taught to meet and remember. In the plazas below, old stories hang in the thin air. People speak of figures who sang to the rocks, who taught the hills to soften and hold shape, then vanished into the high passes. Supporters suggest that singing might mean sound used as a tool, frequency as hammer, tone as chisel. Critics counter that minds under hard labor reach for poetry when mechanics are lost. The walls remain quiet about their methods, but their behavior in earthquakes, how they sway and settle, how corners deflect force and lock it back into the curve, tells you the builders knew the land moves and planned for it. When you put Sacsayhuaman beside Baalbek, beside a staircase under warm water in Yanaguni, and a drowned grid off India's western shelf near Dvarka, another pattern steps forward. Each site carries weight beyond normal lifting habits. Each one resists shaking earth in ways that feel engineered, not lucky. Each one finds the sky as though a compass lay somewhere disguised as myth. North doesn't simply sit nearby. It's knitted into the lines. Alignments aim not just to sunrise but to the long march of the heavens, the slow tilt and circle that takes ages to complete. Far from field camps, there's a desk with a globe and a pen, and lines that curve where paper insists on straight. Geodetic analysis, the practice of mapping on the planet we actually stand upon, not a flat map, shows routes that make no sense to an atlas but fit a sphere. Drag a great circle path from Giza across the blue and watch it brush sites that archaeologists have treated as separate sentences. Trace another arc and it clips a different series of markers, angles repeating like a refrain. You start to wonder whether stones spoke to one another long after their builders went quiet. A field engineer takes leave and boards cheap flights, then buses, then trucks. He carries an old theodolite and a notebook that isn't waterproof. At each site he climbs where guards allow and runs sightlines at dawn. At night he opens star charts that age backward, rewinding the sky to positions not seen by present eyes. He pins bearings to a shared ledger, this temple's axis at Plaza's corner, a causeway's stubborn refusal to drift off true azimuth, and then steps back to see how the numbers stack. The spread looks like a mesh laid over oceans, nodes where you expect them, others where lore never thought to look. In the math, small constants hide like seeds. The ratio of a circle's rim to its width, pi, shows up in the way perimeter meets height when the shapes are folded into triangles and squares. The golden ratio, phi, whispers in slopes and stepped angles, not as a magic number, but as a design choice that keeps turning up where aesthetics and strength shake hands. The long wobble of Earth's axis, the precessional cycle that drags stars through slow arcs over tens of thousands of years, appears in counts 72, 360, 25,920. You don't have to force it, you read it like a habit. Critics counter that if you hunt hard enough for any number you'll find it. Maybe, but the same few keep stepping out of the crowd. Meanwhile, back where concrete warms in the sun, the crane operator swaps shifts and digs his thumb into the groove of a cigarette he doesn't like. He looks at the trilithon one more time and laughs under his breath. The site manager shakes his head when the operator asks for a bigger rig. The joke lands soft. The stones do not move. Up in the hills of Peru, a guide taps a wall and smiles without touching the word. How? Underwater off Yanaguni, A diver runs a hand along a right-angled corner glazed with algae and thyme. These are small acts, they add up. Across a table covered in satellite printouts, arcs in gold marker loop things that shouldn't share a conversation. One line ties geysers to ancient sites across the Atlantic, brushes the Andes and tastes the Pacific on the way to an island of head-staring inland. Another arcs lower, linking temple fields in Southeast Asia to stepped mounds in the Americas. The spacing between some nodes repeats, a quiet beat. If you were laying a mesh for navigation, you might pick that rhythm. If you were picking sacred places with no thought for anyone else's, you wouldn't. Some whisper of a planet-wide network built in an age before the sea ate the shores. Others dismiss this as pattern-making, the brain's addiction to order. Can be both. The alignments exist on maps. Their meaning sits in the gap between ink and intention. When a structure holds dead, true north to a fraction of a degree, someone cared. When a plaza faces a rising point that isn't the sun or the moon of this epoch, someone was watching a clock that ticks slower than a life. That level of care repeats enough times that coincidence begins to taste thin. The thing about precession is that it erases as it reveals. A temple built for a star long set now looks crooked unless you turn the sky back in software and let it fall into place. The engineer with the notebook does this on cheap laptops in ghost houses. He watches Orion slide and the Pleiades sink, fields of stone snapping to attention, only when you set the date to a deep past. Some of the best fits converge around a window that aligns with old flood tales. You can read that as reach. You can read it as a memory that measures in centuries, not stories. Then there's function. A pyramid isn't only a mountain copy or a tomb argument. In these patterns, it also acts like a point you can find over the curve of a planet. Pick 3 well-chosen nodes and you can triangulate a position. Pick dozens and you can travel a world without a compass if you know where to look when the sun drops. A positioning system does not need electricity to work. It needs clear sight, clear math, and time to learn the routes. The humbler details matter as much as the grand lines. Tool marks on granite that bend as though a cutter vibrated at speed. Joint faces shaped so one stone keys into the next against lateral shear, the whole mass bending but not breaking when the ground buckles. Staircases that change, rise height in the last few steps in a way your legs barely feel. Tuned to a human stride, as if the builder walked it and adjusted one riser at a time. You can call that craft. You can also call it the residue of a code learned and carried. If the same code turns up in Yanaguni's terraces, in Dwaka's anchors heavy with encrusted coral, in the polygonal ramparts above Cusco, and beneath Roman history in Lebanon, its authors either traded across water for a very long time or descended from people who did. Geography tells one story, the stones speak a second. Between them, a third story glows, the one where a map predates the current coasts, and the builders place things so that when we would see the mesh they left. This is where satellites help and hinder. They flatten the world where it is curved, but they also let you spot shapes no foot patrol would ever find. Draw those golden arcs again, and this time don't stop where land ends. Let the lines keep going across water you can't walk. Watch them meet, not at one exact dot, but over a wide mid-Atlantic field where lore has long nested a lost land. Others dismiss that lore as wishful saltwater dreaming. The arcs don't prove a continent. They do show attention was paid to a space that has no flags now. If the builders meant the arcs to converge over open sea, why? One answer lives in myth, where drowned islands carry libraries and schools, and where teachers rode away with memory in their heads. Another answer is colder. You set your grid over empty ocean because it never grows forests or cities to hide your markers. Let the winds scour your line into permanence. When someone with a sextant or a mind for angles comes later, they'll find the path still there, even if the source city is gone. There's a quiet risk in reading too much agency into stone. The human mind sticks threads where none exist, but there's a mirror risk on the other side. ignoring how many times weight, quakes and the stars arrive together with numbers sewn into the seams. When the crane operator in Lebanon locks up his cab at dusk, he looks back at the terrace. It looks back without eyes. The day's heat leaks into night, and the blocks keep their own slow weather as though nothing around them matters. Maybe the world's monuments were never separate stories, but chapters bound by the same spine. Not a conspiracy pinned with a red string, but a set of instructions older than our current maps. If that's true, then the unfinished design still runs under our feet. You can follow it into the next room of the puzzle, where old charts claim coastlines we only drilled through in the last century, and where parchment hints at hands that measured an ice-free edge of the world long before our clocks began. A curator eases a roll of parchment across a felt-lined table. Cotton gloves rasp softly as she flattens a corner with a bone folder. Ink blooms in faded greens and reds. Coastlines hooked and curling. Compass roses with petals like small suns. In the lower sweep of the page, a landmass arcs where empty ocean should be. It carries rivers that flow to a bay no ship can reach today, and a serrated spine of mountains where the wind now skates over ice. The room is cool and smells faintly of dust and leather. She leans closer, breath held, as if the lines might shift if she exhaled. This is the Pirouette's map dated 1513, a stitched-together world compiled by an Ottoman admiral who claimed older sources guided his hand. Near the southern edge, the parchment suggests a coast traced as if ice didn't exist. Decades later, seismic pulses from Operation High Jump would map shapes beneath the frozen shelf, and U.S. Air Force cartographers in 1949 would compare those hidden contours to this ink. They noted a resemblance that should not be possible for a map drawn with quills and compasses. If that southern outline reflects a shore scene before the freeze, the source would have to be far older than accepted timelines allow. That pushes beyond 4000 BCE into a world we say was still waking to farming and pottery. Supporters suggest that what we call medieval charts might be palimpsests, preserving fragments copied from even earlier originals. Critics counter that the southern scribble could be a distorted South America pulled too far east. The parchment doesn't settle the argument, it raises it. The Pirii race sheet is not alone. The Orontius Phineas chart of 1531 draws a southern continent with river mouths and interior ridges. The Boache map of the 1700s sketches channels and basins as if the ice were waterlogged glass. These are not identical, but the echoes stack. When multiple maps, separated by centuries, repeat features now buried under ice or sea, the pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. Perhaps different copyists chase the same family of sources, or perhaps the mind finds order where chance is enough. The ink offers clues, not verdicts. Charles Hapgood stepped into that gap with a theory that would stir both fascination and pushback. He proposed a catastrophic displacement of Earth's outer shell, a pole shift that might have slid Antarctica from a milder latitude to the deep south. He wrapped that idea in an antediluvian cartographic tradition, implying a technical grasp of projection and latitude in antiquity. His hypothesis drew early interest, including an endorsement by Albert Einstein noted in those discussions. Mainstream science later rejected the mechanism as implausible. Yet the notion that ancient maps encode a disciplined global understanding keeps resurfacing, like a watermark you only see when the page is held to light. Back in the archive, the curator traces a thumb above a marginal note where Pyrie Rees wrote of assembling his world from older charts. He mentioned sources linked to eras long before his own, some said to go back to the time of Alexander. Some whisper these could be fragments from the Library of Alexandria, the way a conductor might keep a score after the orchestra is gone. Others dismiss that as romance glued to ink. The truth, perhaps, sits in the habit of navigators to copy, correct, and carry forward whatever worked at sea. Accuracy survives because someone needed to make harbor. Modern tools lay a new sheet over the old. Satellite data and radar pierce clouds, and ice to show mountain spines, subglacial valleys, and drowned river systems. Overlays place these features against the antique lines and find portions that match with troubling neatness. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to keep sober minds awake. Supporters suggest this means someone measured coastlines when sea levels and climates were not today's. Critics counter that selective matching can make almost any outline agree if you squint. Both points have weight. The puzzle is that the conversation refuses to die. In universities, postgraduates learn fast where curiosity is welcome and where it is career poison. A thesis that hints these maps record observations from a pre-Ice Age survey can gather frowns before the first page. It is safer to call oddities decorative flourishes or copious distortions. Safer, but often unsatisfying. The risk isn't only ridicule, it is a tightening of the room, like a door that eases shut without a sound, until ideas have to turn sideways to fit inside. A small story passes between librarians. A visiting sailor decades ago stood over this same desk and traced a calloused finger along the southern arc, then tapped a spot where the parchment shows a bay. He said a storm once blew his ship far south, and the ocean's skin changed there, a roll like breath under the water, as if something vast lay just below. It was a sailor's tale, the kind that warms hands over coffee. But it sits beside maps that draw channels beneath ice, and the heat from the cup doesn't make that coincidence vanish. Hapgood's larger frame, the displaced crust and sudden freezing, aims to explain how a temperate shore could become a kingdom of ice within human memory. Geology assigns Antarctica's major glaciation to tens of millions of years. That baseline is hard like bedrock. Instead, he kept hitting seams in the rock, dates that leaned odd, carvings that felt too sure for their age, and hints that a clean timeline had hairline cracks. He didn't rush to declare anything. He underlined, circled, and put question marks in the margins until the page looked like a night sky. The shift took time. It rarely announces itself. A map spread on a kitchen table and a phone call that ran long. A field note about a coastal shelf where anchors sat far from any living harbor. A recorded talk where the floor creaked with every footstep and someone in the third row sighed, tired of hearing the same old story. The air cooled around him as he swapped newsroom deadlines for long trips, funded by book advances and stubborn curiosity. He kept one hand on the basics, dates, stratigraphy, tool marks, and let the other trace patterns that traditional accounts did not link. Then the hill in Turkey opened its quiet mouth. Göbekli Tepe under early light has a sharp chill, even in summer. Dust hangs low. He ran his hand along a T-shaped pillar and felt the shallow bite of carved animal backs and wings. Torchlight flickered and made the foxes move. Dates from the site point to around 11,600 BCE. That figure landed with weight. It undercut the familiar slope of progress. No farms yet, no towns, yet pillars arranged with intent and sighting that tracked the sky. Standing there, he counted the placement of circles and gaps like a musician feeling for time. The stones had been set and then buried on purpose, not toppled by accident. He watched a worker brush grit from a groove that ran ruler straight for a handspan before vanishing at a corner. Some whisper that such precision doesn't bloom overnight in a community new to settled life. Supporters suggest there were teachers in that landscape, people who knew star paths and stress loads long before the plow. His field notebooks carry traces of those days. A smear from a cut finger on gritty stone, a pressed leaf that outlasted a season, and tight handwriting that tries to stick to what can be tested. He measured pillar heights and noted sight lines. He wrote down the feel of each stone under palm, coarse on the flat, almost silky on the worked edges. At night he sat by a camp stove, cut between his hands and sketched horizon lines where bright points would rise. That calm work drew sharp replies. The charred sheet wrote itself, contaminated samples, a mind hungry for patterns. the old sin of joining dots that had no business meeting. Critics countered that independent lines of evidence didn't support his arc. He listened, argued back in print, and sent for new reports. In Indonesia, a site called Gunung Padang pulled him further east. Terraces stepped up a hill, stones laid out in repeating cells, and whispers of ages far older than accepted layers. Access tightened. Permits took months. Doors opened an inch, then closed again. He kept traveling. Off the Indian coast, sonar readouts printed lines like graph paper over dark seabeds. He walked docks and asked fishermen about strange catches. He paddled in small boats over green water and stared down at square shadows while the sun moved behind clouds. Nothing about it felt like an easy on-screen reveal. It was long waits, sleeves rolled, phones that lost signal for days. It was staring at a small screen until your eyes hurt, hoping a clean right angle wasn't a trick of the current. Yet even within ice ages there are warm pulses, interglacials that change coastlines, thawed margins and open passages. If any coast was softer then, a surveyor with simple tools could have traced it from a ship that hugged the shore. Supporters suggest a long tradition of coastal pilots could accumulate such knowledge. Critics counter that systematic global charting requires methods absent from the record. The argument lives in that narrow space between drift and design. Meanwhile, the Boache and Caranches sheets keep their own counsel. Their rivers still snake across paper, and their ridges still rise in ink. When you anchor modern data to those lines, some rivers merge with valleys that radar now confirms under the ice. When they do not, the mismatch reminds us that old maps mixed fact with law, coastline with rumor. No chart of that age is pure, but purity may not be the bar, usefulness often is. Institutional caution hardened as these parallels drew public eyes. You can track it in the way conference panels frame their sessions, in how journals narrow their calls for papers, in how grants shift towards safer harbor. No conspiracy required, just the quiet currents of reputation. Yet curiosity has a way of seeping through scenes. A graduate student tucks a photocopy of Phineas behind a modern atlas. A survey analyst tests a new overlay after hours when the lab is dim and the hum of the machine sounds like dusk. The old stories stand at the edges, watching. Plato's drowned city. Egyptian talk of lands that fell into the sea. Polynesian chants that map island chains now just names on a fishing log. Supporters suggest these myths are memory worn into poetry. Critics counter that water takes what it will, and people everywhere tell flood tales because floods happen. The pull of both views is part of the gravity here. If the maps are real in the way the overlays hint, someone measured the skeleton of our planet before the snow laid its veil across the south. Outside the archive, wind pushes against a window. In Antarctica, that same wind drills across white fields, scouring down to blue ice and glazing it again. A digital cross-section opens like a medical scan, revealing the coastline far below the surface, a rib cage of rock holding its place while the cold breath rises and falls. The curator turns out the light, leaving the parchment in a low glow. The southern arc still lies there, stubborn as a rumor that refuses to quiet. The path bends toward Graham Hancock, a man who walked into this storm of maps and hazard signs with a journalist's notebook and left with a reputation many tried to freeze. We'll sit with him next, in a dim studio where he speaks of ruins under waves and teachers after fire, while the old charts rest in their dark drawers and wait. The tape warps as it rolls. A dim room, buzzing lights, and a younger face on a cathode glow. He speaks in a steady tone about ruins underwater, lines of stone that don't behave like reefs. Across from him, a panel in pressed jackets trade looks and smooth their notes, a cough through a microphone. The clip ends in static and returns to his eyes, calm, stubborn, holding to a claim that keeps slipping off the polite table. Years earlier, his notebook smelled of dust and coffee. He had stood in Ethiopian heat with reporters' credentials and deadlines to meet. The job was to assemble neat paragraphs from dig sites and archives. Meanwhile, the labels thickened around his name: pseudoscientist, conspiracy peddler. Friends warned him that lectures would dry up, and some did. A few universities took invites off the calendar without much explanation. He did late radio appearances and traded sleep for time to answer questions from readers who wrote long emails in the margins of the night. The personal cost came in bits, not all at once. A cancelled talk here, a review that felt like a slap rather than a critique. Travel meant missed dinners and time zones that drifted him out of phase with home. Oddly, the ground shifted in his favor on one of the core points. The official dating at that Turkish hill fell in line with the early numbers he had circled. The age was no longer fringe, it sat printed in journals and museum guides. Yet agreement on a date did not melt the larger dispute. The suggestion of teachers, the idea of an older knowledge base traveling through ruin and flood, this drew a clear line. Others dismiss it as wishful. The wider story still hit the wall of extraordinary claims. He wrote through the pushback. A manuscript became a thick book. Then another. Saudade. That Brazilian word for a deep ache for something missing colored the prefaces. He did not write like a man hunting clicks. He wrote like someone gathering the same shards over and over, trying new arrangements under better light. The phrase he liked to repeat wasn't dramatic. It was stubborn. He was looking for patterns that refused to act like chance. On a long night, he returned to the Ethiopian notes. The smell of incense from old churches, dust on archival folders, and talk of kings whose names fell out of classroom timelines. It wasn't proof, but it was a rhythm. When he later stepped into the Gunung Padang debate, that rhythm carried him. The terrace stones felt warm at noon, and still warm after sundown. Tools scratched, measuring tapes clicked back into their cases, and the hill seemed to hold a suggestion in its geometry that stayed coy every time someone tried to nail it to a single century. The push and pull with institutions hardened into a routine. Papers that might have gone to journals went to bookstores. He showed up at conferences, only to debate the premise of his method rather than the details. A few colleagues spoke in low voices after panels and admitted they shared some of his doubts about the timeline, if not his model for fixing it. Others wrote him off in public and asked polite questions in private. He started keeping two kinds of notes, one for the record, another for the whispered edges. He used the same care with celestial claims as he did with stones. At that hill of pillars, he tracked how reliefs might map to star forms, and how seasonal markers could fit into the layout. He didn't stake the farm on a single line to a single star. He built a case out of weighted hints. Later, standing on a coastal ridge where old anchor stones lay, he watched the sky. The breeze carried salt. The constellations moved on their slow wheel. If the site builders mark those patterns, then the work asks for patience measured in lifetimes. Back in the studio footage from the 90s, he looks composed. Behind the calm, there's bone tiredness. He answers a question about undersea structures with restraint. He doesn't wave his arms. He talks about sonar returns, straight lines, and the neater look where coastlines used to run when the ice was tall and the seas were low. The panelists offer smiles that don't reach their eyes. The host wraps the segment early. Those nights off air are where the human part shows. He ate late, looked over notes, and weighed how much of his own life he could bend around a question that would not let go. He pared down claims where the ground felt soft. He sharpened the ones anchored by dates, cuts, and alignments that repeated across sites. It wasn't all fun, but work like this rarely is. It's long corridors, locked cabinets, and travel folders thick with receipts and dry boarding passes. When he finally said, the line landed hard with people who'd seen the same odd rhymes between places and times and wondered why the tune never made it into the symphony. There's a quiet irony at the heart of it. The site that most bruised the old timeline now features in museum displays, tour brochures, and textbooks. Its date stays put at an age that reshapes what we thought we knew about when complex design and skywatching began. The guardrail still stands on the other side of the road, though. The question of who taught whom and when remains fenced, with polite signs warning that speculation lies beyond. He returns to Turkey, to Indonesia, and to the blue water shelves off India. He carries a little kit of tools, laser measurer, notebook, soft brush, and patience. He speaks with divers, caretakers, and old men who remember their fathers pointing at odd stones and telling stories that didn't match official plaques. He listens more than he talks. He writes down the part that can live on a page and leaves the rest where it belongs, in the air of the place, in the way a hill holds heat, in the way a pillar feels colder than it should at dawn. If the pattern holds, if the signs point to teachers who stepped into the ruins and taught survivors how to lay out circles and read the sky, then what we call the start of history might be closer to a restart. That idea is heavy. It also explains the strange leaps in the record, the way agriculture, monument building, and star skills show up in multiple places within the same narrow window, as if a hand moved quietly across a shattered map. The room with the old camera returns one more time. The younger face is gone now, older eyes in a recent interview. He sits straighter, voice lower, and repeats the line about stories in the past. He doesn't ask you to believe him. He asks you to look. The screen fades to a still shot of that hill of pillars under a hard sun. For a second it's easy to see a teacher on the ridge, pointing to where a star would rise after the long winter finally broke. If that teacher stood there, then something stood before the storm and taught them. If the storm arrived, it didn't take the memory of how to look up. The next step in our story waits where sky scars and stones meet, and just beyond that ridge the air thins as though the sky fell once and could again. Cold air leaks from a door as it opens to a Greenland lab after midnight. The room hums softly. A technician steadies a clear cylinder of ancient ice on a padded cradle, her breath fogging the visor as she leans in. Under the bench lamp a dark seam appears like a bruise trapped in glass. She lifts a thin blade, shaves a sliver, and the fragment pops as it warms, releasing air last breathed by mammoths. Soot flecks drift in the petri dish. A sensor chirps for platinum. Under a different light, tiny crystals flash with the hard sparkle of diamonds, so small they dust the slide like frost. These layers carry a date about 12,800 years ago. The number is lesser count and more a scar. Supporters suggest a swarm of comet fragments hit or exploded overhead, spraying molten droplets and debris across multiple continents at once. Critics counter that volcanoes, wildfires, and dust storms can lay down strange chemistry, and that timing can blur in mud and ice. The bench doesn't argue. It offers only the texture of carbon spheres, magnetic grains and glass that formed at heat few natural fires reach on their own. Maps on a nearby wall show a pattern that bothers people who like straight answers. On the Atlantic side of North America, 500,000 shallow ovals, Carolina bays, pock the coastal plain. They tilt the same way, as if they turn their heads to hear a call from the northwest. Each depression holds sand rims swirled like a spoon once stirred them hard. Geologists have many models: wind on wet ground, chaotic storms, even slow-blooming lakes shaped by time. Some whisper that a storm of ice and fire carved them quickly, their shared bearing pointing back to a northern impact. The sand keeps its own counsel. The climate story reads like a trapdoor. Within decades, temperatures drop as much as 15 degrees. Grasslands dry, then return under cold. Storm tracks shift. Ice advances. Rivers cease. Animals that once thundered across valleys leave bone fields that go on and on. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats fall silent with a speed that feels wrong for slow change. Campfires go out on floodplains as people move, hide or vanish from the record. In some rock shelters middens the trash layers that mark time skip a beat. A hearth holds charcoal. Tools lie clean and then nothing, like dinner interrupted and never finished. Across the Atlantic, layers tell a similar tale. From Belgium to Syria and down to Chile, dark seams of soil called black mats rest at the same moment on the clock. They hold nanodiamonds, high-temperature melt glass, and carbon spherules that look like tiny cooked seeds. Heat is the author here, and speed. Supporters point to these as fingerprints of a cosmic event, skywide fire, shock waves, and rainouts of molten spray. Others dismiss the link and point to lightning, peat fires, or other high-energy natural means. The microscope doesn't pick sides. It only shows what came to rest when the world changed temperature fast. On the floor, a rolled chart of the Great Plains shows traces of a vanished sea. Lake Agassiz once covered a chunk of the continent, tied behind walls of ice. When those dams failed, water roared out in bursts that remade coasts and carved channels into bedrock. River mouths jumped. Lowlands drowned. In the stories kept on clay and in memory, a familiar sequence appears. Fire from the sky, a world of water, then a struggle to start again. Some whisper that myths preserved the shock of outburst floods and impact winters in a language that families could carry. Whether stories came from comet ash or bursting lakes, the ground agrees on violence. The word impact often draws a clean cartoon, a single strike, a crater, an ending. What the Earth shows looks messier. It hints at air bursts, explosions in the sky, over ice sheets. These would leave little obvious crater but wide wreckage, mixed chemistry and fires. Forests don't need much to light when the air goes dry and hot, and embers fall like rain. Charcoal in coarse spikes. Soot in ice rises. Tiny glass droplets form when sand or rock flashes and cools while flying. They land far from the blast, like the sky tossed them from its pockets as it ran. Archaeology records the human rhythm. In North America, Clovis spear points mark a culture known for sharp edges and wide reach. Then, in layers dated to the cold restart, their signatures slip. Settlements thin. Tool traditions change. In some places, sites look frozen mid-task. Others are simply gone. The gap feels like a breath held too long. Critics counter that cultural change doesn't need a comet. Drought, disease, or new prey can also shuffle the deck. That's true, and yet the timing sits tight against the soot and the cold. Genetic data adds another kind of ledger. In mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, researchers see a squeeze in numbers that suggests a near miss for our species. Populations shrink to what might be measured in thousands. Then, as the world warms again, lineages branch outward. Paths rear out inland. Coastal groups that once hugged shorelines leave fewer traces because rising seas erase their homes. Supporters suggest that if people built along the old edges of the continents, most of their leftovers now lie underwater or buried under silt, out of easy reach. The genome doesn't show cities. It whispers that only a few made it through. Out on the coastal shelf, survey boats drag sonar and pull up lost histories by accident. Fishermen bring up mammoth bones tangled in nets over Doggerland. Submerged plains appear where people could once walk from what we call England to what we call Europe. The sea buried camps and paths under meters of water. If that happened in the north, the thought spreads. What of the rest of the drowned world? Shorelines move like snakes when ice melts. Habitations follow food and fresh water. The record we keep on land is only the part that stayed dry. In lab drawers, thin sections of sediment sit like pressed flowers. Under magnification, black mats reveal lumpy spheres of carbon and clusters of tiny diamonds, formed under pressure, heat, or both. Platinum spikes in the same layers tease the mind. Supporters argue that platinum-rich meteor material rained down, while critics caution that volcanic plumes can move similar metals. The argument continues at conferences. Back at the bench, the lab worker holds a slide to the light. The dust shines in a way that feels older than the debate about it. Weather does not fall the same everywhere, even in crisis. In some regions, the cold clamps down hard. In others, rainbelts run for new ground. Farmers cannot plant ice, and hunters cannot follow animals that are gone. The pressure of simple needs, fire, food, shelter, drives invention and collapse alike. A family might hew a home into lowest cliffs, ride out the worst on roots and fish, and teach children a different sky. One night under that sky, someone tells a child about fire that fell in sheets, and water that ran across the land like a beast. The child grows and repeats the pattern until it becomes a tradition with teeth. The Carolina bays keep their quiet curve, stand at the edge of one after rain, and the sand squeaks underfoot with that dry, soaked sound. Long grasses bend in a steady wind from the ocean. Birds track the oval as if obeying a painted line, push a stick into the rim, and it meets layers of sorted grains. Like waves pack them there with a rhythm too regular for chance. Geomorphologists model wind over wet ground and get shapes surprisingly close. Others point to the shared compass and say the sky wrote them instead. 2 stories, 1 field, and the angle of each ellipse like the hand on a clock. In the northern hemisphere, aurora spreads in curtains when the sun spits. During geomagnetic storms, the sky may flicker so bright you can read by it. After the proposed impact window, high-latitude nights would have held a different glow. Fire at ground level and smoke above. Night would taste like ash. Day would feel low. Over time, the planet would cool fast as dust and water vapor changed the balance. Then it would thaw again. These are not gentle shifts. They break calendars. They turn rivers the wrong way. They make the old rules short. Critics will keep saying the timeline carries 1,000 moving parts. They're right. The Earth systems braid and unbraid, and yet the 12,800-year mark keeps showing up in ice, in soil, in charcoal, in stories. You can follow it from a petri dish under a lamp to a dune by a shallow oval. From a dark band in Chile to a kettle pond in Maine. From a gene tree to a spear point left half-napped beside an old firing. There is no single smoking crater placed neatly on a map. There is instead a chorus of signals that rose together and then faded. In a cave, a hand drags soot across rock to mark a shape that looks like rain falling from above. Not wavy lines, straight strokes. A few steps away, a cache of seeds sits in a basket blackened by time, a hiss locked in carbon. Outside, air knifes down from the ice, and the only warm places are those measured by bodies and embers. Fires hold back the long night. Words do the rest. The story of the burn and the water joins the everyday work of sharpening tools and keeping children asleep. Toward the end of the cold phase, meltwater finds new paths. Ice surrenders edge by edge. Sea levels climb in swift steps. Old bays fill with brackish water and then salt. Coastlines move like soft clay. Whatever stood near the ancient shore goes under. Some whisper that if advanced coastal societies existed before the hit and the freeze, their wharves, avenues and workshops now lie where only divers and machines can go. Others dismiss that as romance layered on ruin. The truth perhaps sits on the seabed, patient and silted, waiting for lights that have not yet arrived. Back in the Greenland lab, the technician warms her hands around a mug as the centrifuge slows. The filtered residue settles like dark snow. A readout plot spikes and dips with the calm of a heart that knows its beat. Outside, the wind scrapes along the building. She labels the vial with the date and the depth and sets it into a rack. Later, someone will run numbers, argue over them, and publish. For now, the vial simply holds a moment when the air itself changed character. Step outside the door and look north. The horizon is a long blade of cold blue. If you were here 12,800 years ago, you might have seen the sky tear in luminous sheets, felt the ground shake and run toward higher ground without knowing why. Inside some shelter, fires would start again. People would seal cracks with moss and hide. They would carry forward only what they could hold in mind. A song with numbers in it. The memory of stars in a pattern that meant safety. A warning about nights when the air smells like metal. Torchlight shivers against damp stone as a hand, cracked by cold and ash, draws a line of charcoal across a cave wall. Not deer, not the chase. Points linked by thin strokes form a shape you recognize from modern star apps, though no one here owns a sky chart. The air tastes of smoke and wet limestone. A child coughs in the dark behind you, the sound small and hollow, while the elder finishes a circle and adds a curling tail that bites its own edge. The picture isn't a scene from life. It's a clock set in the heavens, ticking across a span no single person could live to count. When cities are gone and paper rots into mud, you don't rebuild with manuals, you rebuild with stories. Across coastlines that no longer exist, on islands that later sank and on floodplains that hardened into salt, tales begin the same way. The world made, the world spoiled, water rising, a few saved who know what to teach. Some whisper this symmetry hints at a memory that refused to die. Others dismiss the echo as human imagination, choosing the same arc over and over, like a favorite song that fits the voice. The pattern holds anyway 127 times at least, in places where messengers never met. The puzzle is more than repetition. It lies in the sequence itself. Creation, decline, deluge, renewal. Not a vague wash of symbolism, but a structured plot with survivors as couriers of lost knowledge. If each tale formed in isolation, why does the same skeleton stand up in Sumer and the Yucatan, in valleys once crossed by elephants and in islands where outrigger canoes touched the horizon? Some listeners call it coincidence, a trick of storytelling that comforts the mind. Supporters suggest it reads like a ledger of weather and sky, copied by voices until the ink of words fixed it in place. Look closer at the symbols the elder leaves behind. A snake swallowing its tail curls near a set of 7 marks, spaced like a rhythm you can count with your fingertips. The serpent, some say, maps a cycle that returns to its start. Not a year, but the slow wobble of the planet's axis. The long sweep that shifts which stars rise at dawn. Those 7 marks match clusters that trace seasons in cultures oceans apart. A canoe of points becomes a teacher's story by the fire. The lesson hides in the image. When this star sits here, plant. When the tail touches the sun's path, beware the waters. You see the same spine of story names wearing different clothes. In Sumer, it's Zusudra, stepping into a vessel built on instruction. In Hebrew lore, Noah receives craft and measurement to ride out a world of rain. On the subcontinent, Manu learns the shape of survival and the steps to start again. Across the Maya lowlands, the deluge arrives, and those who remember the counts begin time anew. Distances are vast, languages split like branches, yet the bones match. Critics counter that floods are common, and people repeat what works. The odd part isn't the flood, it's the synchronized order and the way the stars sit inside the lines. Those numbers that keep walking back into the tale are not decorative. A circle with 360 parts, a count that favors 72 as if it were a natural pulse. A longer track of 25,920, not rounded but precise in a way that stirs the back of your mind. The Sumerian way of marking time, the Maya's long clock with stones and days nested within days, the Egyptian deacons slicing the night sky into steady stairsteps. They all hum with the same mathematics. Supporters suggest this points to a cosmology deeper than calendars for planting wheat. It feels like a gear set into the sky that someone long ago measured with patient eyes. A pillar waits on a Turkish ridge, heavy and cooled by night air, carved with creatures that don't simply decorate. They point, they lean, They freeze mid-stride in the directions of constellations as they appeared in an age of cold. The date matches the black layer in ice and the ashen soil elsewhere, a time when something bright and hard burned its way across the story. Some whisper the carvers weren't praying. They were recording. A warning in limestone that says, "When the sky looks like this, remember what came next." No sermon, just stars anchored in stone with an accuracy that feels like a calibration. You can test a story by watching how far it travels intact. Sailors leaving the coast of a now drowned shelf pass it on to children who will never see the shoreline as it was. Fishermen teach their sons the same star line to follow back when cloud breaks. In the desert, herders mark a stone with a notch that aligns the sunrise on a day when the wind shifts. In the highlands, a woman keeps a 7-beat chant that matches the moving cluster overhead. The method looks simple. It performs as a memory engine, robust because it doesn't rely on metal or ink. It survives shrinkage and expansion. It survives a winter that lasts 1,000 nights. There's a deeper rhythm here that speaks to the way minds store threat. A snake returns to its tail because danger comes in loops. The 7 wise ones visit in many languages because a specific star group sits in the same place when the danger begins. The old stories may sound like fable, but their scaffolding holds fixed quantities, not dreams. Counts of days, counts of degrees, counts of the long drift of the pole. Others dismiss this as an overlay, modern eyes forcing math onto myth. The counterweight is the recurrence of exact tallies that keep cropping up where they don't need to if the purpose is only ceremony. Not all the carriers wore robes. In some versions they arrive wet and hungry, their tools wood and cord, their lessons about angles learned by watching shadows shorten and lengthen. The label teachers from the stars might mean glow or wisdom rather than distance. Supporters suggest they were survivors of a coast now underwater, walking inland with maps in their heads. They teach how to square a foundation, how to watch for the sky's warning wobble, how to keep the length of the year when the fields you knew are gone. The tale preserves the face, not the method. The method hides in the numbers and the sky marks. In caves far from the sea, charcoal records a set of constellations positioned as they would have appeared when ice-crowded valleys and animals the size of buses roamed. The date implied by those star positions matches events that left traces in soil cores and glacial layers elsewhere. The artists weren't sketching for beauty alone. They were locking the heavens to the earth like a clasp. If the clasp closes the same way again, the message whispers, "Do this next." It's less scripture than operating procedure, shaped as a story you can say aloud around embers. The way these tales cross distance reveals a clever trick. A group says the serpent eats its tail. Another says a wheel turns. A third sings of a river in the sky that loops back. Different images, same function. The story compiles itself to fit local plants, local winds, local gods, but under the theme the constants recur. 72 steps mark a degree of the long wobble, 360 fills the circle cleanly, 25,920 finishes the cycle. You don't need a bronze astrolabe to keep this in your head. You need a song that lands on the same notes each time. Some of the carvings on that ridge in Anatolia are animals with postures that match not their behavior, but the layout of stars at a specific date. The vulture's wing angle, the scorpion's curl, the long-necked creature craning toward a point on the ecliptic. The detail feels fussy until you realize fuss is the point. Precision encodes the timestamp. Critics counter that pattern-seeking minds can draw lines between any set of dots they can. Yet when those dots land on the same coordinates across multiple sites and myths, the pattern feels less like indulgence and more like design. Oral memory can carry more than poets' flourishes. Aboriginal elders recount shorelines where their grandchildren stand 10 miles inland, their words matching geological reconstructions of drowned coasts. In that light, a flood story becomes a map keyed to rising water. A star tale becomes a calendar that outlasts kings. Stone can be toppled, clay tablets can burn. A chant can leap a mountain pass hidden under snow and still deliver its cargo intact. This method lacks spectacle, it excels in durability, especially when the climate forgets to be kind. The overlap between lore and metric might point to a quiet alliance. Perhaps groups adapted to separate continents and different animals, but use the same mechanism to remember what nearly erased them. One keeps count with knots in a cord, another with cuts in bone, another with the positions of bright points repeated with a hand's breadth held at arm's length. Supporters suggest this convergent design wasn't luck, it was necessity born from losing the tools that make records easy. The result looks like myth from a distance. Up close, it behaves like a repository. The cave cools as the torch burns low. The elder taps the wall once, a small click, then sets the charcoal down. The marks won't feed anyone. They won't keep rain off sleeping children tonight. Still, the effort feels urgent, like packing seeds into dry soil just before the flood recedes. In that urgency, you can hear a different kind of building, not walls, not towers, a network. Each clan keeps a piece, each season refines a verse, each generation tests the count against sunrise and just a note if the sky drifts. So when you hear that the world began, went wrong, drowned, and restarted with those who remembered, you're not only hearing a morality tale, you're hearing a framework that instructs listeners to watch the horizon with more than awe. It teaches a habit, align time with the long cycle, and when the long cycle turns, move. Some whisper that's the oldest engineering we own, disguised as bedtime story. Others dismiss the idea and prefer the comfort of poetry. The cave doesn't argue. It offers marks that match the heavens as they were when the last great cold began and leaves the rest for us to weigh. The torch dips and the carvings retreat into the half-dark. What survives isn't a machine. It's the muscle memory of a species that decided to store its tools in the one medium fire and flood cannot reach, the living mind. If a civilization rose and fell before ours, its hard goods are dust. Its soft goods may still travel on breath and rhythm, reassembled each night in the same order, carried by faces lit from below by coals. The cave exhales cool air, and for a moment it feels like a vault that's still open. Out in the night, the same star cluster clicks into place above the ridge as a stone and charcoal version fixed inside. The match is close enough to feel deliberate. The story works because the sky still plays along. We follow that thread to a different kind of archive, one carried inside every person alive, to ask if the record of what happened next hid in more than myth. If memory can store blueprints, perhaps blood did too. And the next clues won't be under rock but inside us, waiting to be read. Blue-white light washes the lab in a clean glow, the kind that makes everything look sharper than it feels. A geneticist hunches over her monitor and scrolls through lines of code that aren't words at all, but letters stacked like beads. ATCG, moving in set rhythms. The room hums, air flows through vents with a low breath. Her finger taps the glass when a string of markers appears in a place it shouldn't, a faint echo in the code that reads like an accent from a language no one speaks anymore. She leans closer until her reflection blurs with the sequence, as if she could step through the screen and walk the path those letters took to get here. You follow the thread to its root. Mitochondrial Eve, the woman whose line survives in every person alive, stands somewhere in the deep past, 150,000 to 200,000 years behind us. The story taught in schools draws a clean arrow out of Africa and into the wider world. But the code is not a straight road. It's a braided river. Branches split, circle back, and cross. Some drift apart earlier than the maps allow, crossing oceans on timelines that feel out of place. None of this breaks the out-of-Africa frame, complicates it. It says migration wasn't one march, but many pulses, some of which we barely register without these strands of cellular memory. That's where the anomalies arrive. Certain haplogroups in Aboriginal Australian families carry divergence clocks that tick older than the supposed landing dates. Far across the ocean, a few Amazonian communities hold markers that hint at a split much earlier than the textbooks grant. Critics counter that clocks drift and dates hinge on assumptions. That's fair. But the pattern doesn't vanish. It tilts in the light and suggests a longer prelude, as if people carried memories across coastlines that no longer exist, walking shorelines now drowned, leaving their stories not in stone but in mitochondria. A single finger bone in a Siberian cave widened that frame more than any monument. Denisova. The bone looked ordinary. The DNA did not. It revealed a branch close to us and yet distinct, and that branch shows up in modern people, especially in Melanesians and Aboriginal Australians, with percentages that can't be waved off as trace. The odd part is the road between. We have DNA linking the far ends of the map, but little in the middle to walk it by. Supporters suggest that whole landscapes of contact took place on coastlines erased by the sea. Others dismiss this as overreach. Still, the code keeps whispering, you met, you lived, you had children, and the children are still here. Then there are the ghost lineages, footprints without feet. Geneticists find signals of a fourth, unknown hominin in parts of Africa. Threads woven through modern genomes that don't match Neanderthal, don't match Denisovan, and don't match us alone. No bones, no skulls, just the echo in the code. The implication is simple, even if the story is not. People met other people. They shared not just shelter and food, but futures. Some of those futures survive in your hemoglobin, your immune response, your ability to breathe thin air. The record falls silent in the ground and keeps talking in blood. Population genetics then lowers the room's temperature. Around 70,000 years ago, there was a bottleneck so tight that our ancestors may have been counted in thousands, not millions. The genome remembers that pinch. What it also remembers are diversity peaks before and after, little spikes that don't sit well with a slow, steady climb. Cycles show up, growth, spread, contraction. Some whisper that those cycles could reflect complex societies rising along old coasts and then fading in the cold. Critics counter that climate alone can etch the same pattern. Both may be right. A glacier doesn't care if you have language or pottery. It arrives, and coastlines turn to ice. While the lab hums, the ground answers with old crafts that feel untimely. In Kenya, obsidian blades dated to roughly 320,000 years ago show signatures of heat treatment, which means someone learned to bake stone to make it cleave just so. In South Africa's Blombos Cave, a small piece of ochre bears a crosshatch design from around 75,000 years ago. It is tidy, deliberate, not a bored hand scratching. In the Altai, a tiny piece of jewelry attributed to Dennis Ovens bears drill precision that makes a modern jeweler squint. None of this proves cities or engines. It does nudge the timeline of when minds like ours began leaving marks that look like planning, not just instinct. The lab brings up another gene, microcephalin, linked to brain growth. It seems to flare across Eurasia about 37,000 years ago, in a pattern that looks like a sweep fast and broad. Some whisper about an inheritance from an archaic cousin. Others dismiss that as reading too much into a noisy signal. Yet the timing is curious. Language expands. Art caves bloom across Europe. Toolkits standardize and spread. You don't need a myth to see that something quickened in those layers. The code might hold a shard of why. Soil itself has become an archive. Sediment in Siberian caves holds DNA traces where bones do not. Layer by layer, the dirt reveals Neanderthal in one stratum, Denisovan in another, and modern human threads running through both. Not in a straight swap, but in overlaps that suggest shared fires, borrowed words, mixed families. Hearth soot and DNA dust mingling for tens of thousands of years. The story starts to feel less like neat branches and more like a forest edge where roots tangle. Speech enters the conversation with FOXP2, a gene associated with syntax and vocal control. It took its human-specific shape before 100,000 years ago. The spread looks more like a wave than a drift. If you could listen to that wave, you might hear the spread of structured language itself. Not just the names of things, but the grammar of how to share a plan, a warning, a star's rising. Supporters suggest that when language firmed up, memory could stretch beyond one lifetime and one shoreline. Critics counter that this reading ties too much to one gene. The safer point sits in the middle. Something gave us the breath and tongue to pass maps we could not draw. Now the camera slides back to the anomalies in living people. In the Andes and high Himalaya, certain genes linked to oxygen processing arrive through archaic lines, helping hearts beat well above sea level. Along European and Asian lines, parts of the immune system carry Neanderthal heritage. This is not about superior and inferior. It's about encounter, about how we became a composite built for varied climates because we met others built for those climates. Our bodies are evidence of cooperation as much as conflict. Return to the bottleneck. If a near extinction winnowed us to a few thousand, and yet diversity blooms again soon after, where did the new branches come from? One answer is simple. Isolated groups survived in pockets, then reunited. Another adds a twist. Coastlines served as refuges, and later as highways when waters rose. A third softens into a story of amnesia and recall. Skills fall out of practice, then recover when survivors meet teachers or reopen old routes. The genome preserves the structure of the story without telling us the plot. This is where those old tools and marks in caves feel less like museum pieces and more like signatures. The crosshatch at Blombos might be a tally, a symbol, a pattern to fix a rhythm in memory. Heat-treated blades suggest a shared recipe. Put the stone near fire, watch the color. Count heartbeats, quench. Precision holes in a ornament say hands trusted their measurements. Are these cities hidden under ice? Number. They are people acting like us, solving, sharing, repeating, long before we grant them the title civilized. You can almost feel the press of a thumb anchoring a bead as a drill turns. It's human-sized proof. The geneticist in the lab runs her cursor over a haplogroup map. Lines light up across Indonesia, into Sahul and back through Asia like faint roads. She writes a note in the margin. Early splits. Coastal option. It's a plain phrase with a heavy meaning. If ancient coasts held the densest populations, as many models say, then sea rise would hide most early settlements, and what we find inland is the exception that survived. That absence bends the record toward the few dry places, while the genome whispers about the drowned ones. Think of it this way. The code inside you is a palimpsest, a manuscript scraped and rewritten, but never fully cleared. Old lines faintly bleed through new ink. Some whisper that within this script lie traces of teachers and planners from ages we would call prehistoric. Critics counter that DNA stores biology, not lesson plans. Perhaps both are off the mark. The truth, perhaps, is that memory has many shelves. Stone carries one kind. Myth carries another. Cells carry a third. When one collapses, the others keep a few pages safe. That's the unsettling grace of it. We keep looking for the library in the ground and miss that some of its catalog sits inside our cells. Not the full text, just headings, summaries, the tune of a chorus without the verses. Enough to say people met and made families with neighboring kinds, enough to say knowledge can ride a body as well as a book. The geneticist closes her notebook and rubs a thumb across the edge, leaving a slight smudge. The hum in the room seems louder now. Those letters on her screen could be blueprints, not for temples but for stubborn traits. Memory scaffolding, breath for thin air, a tongue fit for a crowded story. If advanced builders ever stood on coasts now drowned, if they taught neighbors and moved on, they may not have vanished. They may have thinned to a thread and survived in you, which turns the next puzzle into a question of craft. If the code carries hints of old minds at work, What might their tools have looked like when hands met stone? The cursor blinks. Somewhere, a tuning fork waits beside a block of andesite. The level trembles in her hands. Wind scrapes across the altiplano and slips under her jacket, a dry cold that settles in the joints. She wipes grit from the tripod foot, peers through the eyepiece, and exhales. The red andesite block at Pumapunku stares back in a clean line. She nudges the adjustment screw until the crosshair kisses the corner, 0.5 millimeter. The number sits there, neat as a parking ticket, on a stone that's been rained on for 1,000 winters. Her pencil taps the clipboard. Another reading confirms it, and a third quiets the doubt. Granite dust clings to her fingers, even though she's touching only air and glass and brass. You move closer and see small things that aren't small, an inside corner that meets itself with an edge as crisp as folded paper. A groove that runs true, no wobble, no chatter, like a cut made by a blade that didn't breathe. Textbooks give you sketches of copper chisels and hammerstones, of braided ropes and wooden sleds, and a patient line of hands. Yet the block under that lens holds a different mood. It carries the stillness of a machined part, the sort of clarity you expect from a milled die or a precision jig. In the shade, you trace a fingertip along a recessed shelf that fits a neighbor's stone like a key in a lock. That is the paradox. We're told Bronze Age hands chipped away with soft copper against hard igneous rock. Copper dense at a touch from granite. Andesite pushes back and wins. Meanwhile, in quarries and workshops today, diamond blades spin fast under cooling water to keep heat from warping a cut. In labs, ultrasonic tools buzz at high frequency to nibble a groove through crystal without cracking it. Out here, half a world away and deep in time, you meet surfaces that echo those methods. Straight lines with the even striations of a saw. Interior holes with coaxial walls too regular for a casual punch and twist. It makes your mouth go dry the way a magic trick does when you stand right beside the table and still can't see the thread. Some of the most stubborn pieces sit where earthquakes are common. Polygonal walls in the Andes flex like knuckles. Blocks with many faces meet at odd angles, each facet leaning into another so the structure sways and settles without failing. No mortar, no glue, just weight and shape. Engineers who study earthquake resistance tilt their heads here. They run their fingers along bevel joints that redirect force, along sloped faces that shed vibration like rain. When they sketch the pattern back at a desk, the drawing looks less like a wall and more like a three-dimensional puzzle locked by geometry itself. The pattern doesn't stop in one country. Trapezoidal openings repeat from the highlands of Peru to temple corridors in Japan. An odd echo that shrugs at oceans. Narrower at the top, wider at the base. A doorway that braces itself against shock and time. You find tool marks in hard stones on different continents that share the look of rotary cutting. In granite, a slow saw leaves lines like the grooves on a vinyl record. Several artifacts preserve those rings in a way that suggests a steady feed rate and even pressure. Others dismiss this. They say sensitive eyes find patterns where chaos sits. Yet the numbers in the field book at Pumapunku give their own counterpoint. Tolerance is tighter than the swell of a thumbnail. Close to the Nile, a machinist's eye took those measurements to task. He studied granite artifacts and saw evidence of cutting head pressures beyond what a copper blade, even with sand abrasive, can sustain. He traced grooves that are shallow, uniform, and suggest a high-frequency vibration rather than a blunt strike. In his view, what we call ceremonial stonework behaves in tests like parts formed with industrial control. He goes further, some whisper, arguing the Great Pyramid on the plateau is not a tomb at all, but a machine shaped to interact with forces in the ground. The suggestion sits at the edge of the map, but it lives there with a set of observations about precision, geometry, and materials that won't stop knocking. Walk back to the high mesa and listen to the wind work the edges of the blocks. A fine powder lifts and falls in eddies behind the stones. A researcher sets down a small tuning fork on a slab, taps it, and holds it near the surface. Dust shivers. It doesn't jump to the ceiling, but it does move, lines forming where the waves meet the stone's skin. Ultrasonic welders do this to metal, fusing seams without flame. Acoustic levitation can hold a bead of liquid between pressure nodes. None of it is magic, it is physics in a narrow band where matter begins to respond to voice and rhythm. In pieces of lore, across languages that never met, you hear about singing stones, a god who softened rock with a song, workers who moved blocks with tone. Supporters suggest those lines are memory turned into story, encoding a method in a metaphor. If you tune a frequency to match a material's heart, the material answers, it loosens, it slides, or so the whisper goes. Critics counter that legends bend like reeds in wind, and a song is far from a tool. Still, in front of you stand features that don't match a simple hammer and chisel picture, and the resonance idea gives a path from impossibility to testable hunch. What would a toolkit adjusted for sound look like? In your bag, a small generator, a transducer, a rig that couples vibration into stone without burning it, a frame that uses water pressure to carry stress away so cracks don't grow. Heat is the enemy with brittle material, water calms heat, vibration gives you shape without the same load as a blade. And if you wanted to avoid leaving a clear metal signature, no iron filings, no copper smears in the microscopic scratches, a process built on pressure waves would keep the record clean. The absence of familiar residue is not proof of anything. It does, however, leave a space where other ideas can stand for a minute and be looked at. Elsewhere on the plateau you meet a familiar joint. It is an H-shaped cut in stone that forms a socket. A matching tongue down the line sets into it and locks two blocks in plane and in height. This kind of joinery borrows from woodcraft but demands more effort in rock. Many such joints sit flush, hidden once the neighbor engages. Their faces are fine, their corners even. They allow a wall to act as a single unit without mortar. Shake the ground and the units share the insult until the energy bleeds away. If you can do this with hand tools, then do it 100 times. In hard rock, with no drifting measurement, your team's hands must carry meters in their nerves. Down in Egypt, granite cores and drill holes keep resurfacing in workshops and papers. Cylindrical samples pulled out of stone bear spiral grooves with a consistent pitch. That spiral means the tool moved forward a certain distance per turn. Copper with sand can drill, it just does so slowly and it leaves a Messier story. Some cores look like the cut advanced faster than that. Again, that machinist's claim sits in the mix, pressures and feed rates unheard of in the age we assign to the work. Coupled with stone artifacts that have flatness across faces measurable in fractions of a millimeter, the picture becomes odd. Not impossible, some will say, but odd enough to hold your attention through lunch. If the functions of these structures matter, then their form tells you why. Seismic joints keep a temple standing. Trapezoids lock openings that would otherwise creep. Mass damps vibration. These are solutions to problems that return across ages. It might be that distant builders learned the same hard lessons in parallel, or there was a shared handbook of sorts, passed mouth to ear by masons who rode with traders along lines older than our maps. That interpretation keeps human craft front and center. It gives respect to the long patience of practice and to the kind of knowledge that lives in a wrist. Then again, there is the drumbeat of the cuts, straight and clean in places where the tool should wander. Inner corners tight, not rounded, as if a blade with thickness near zero traced them. We know tricks to achieve that today. We drill relief holes, then chisel out the waste, then grind. We jig and clamp and check with gauges. The ancient stones sometimes show a finish that would pass inspection now. That is where the mind wanders back to sound, to pressure, to fields. Not as sorcery, but as a neat box of options that could leave few fingerprints on the record. In workshops where acoustics meet matter, Sand jumps into patterns on a plate when tone hums through it. Water columns stand still at nodes while waves whip around them. Resonant cavities focus energy into a tight pocket. Some researchers apply similar ideas to large shapes and map where stress falls away and where it spikes. If an old builder tuned stones and spaces into a sympathetic set, the structure itself could have been an instrument. A quiet one, built not for the ear, but for fatigue and time. In such a model, walls hum beneath storms in a range too low to hear and shrug off the push. Even the idea of a machine-shaped monument returns in a different light when framed as resonance and flow, rather than wires and sparks. Perhaps the structure guided energy fields the way a tuned chamber guides sound. Perhaps it didn't. The test is simple in spirit and hard in practice. Measure, map, and try to reproduce effects at scale, without leaping to conclusions while the data is young. Until then, we carry two ideas at once. A toolkit advanced in ways we haven't found, or a long training in stone that simply exceeds our expectations of patience. Late in the afternoon, that surveyor steps back from her tripod. She sets tuning fork against her wrist, lets it sing, and holds it near a sandstone chip at her feet. Ultrafine dust lifts and settles in soft ripples. Matter listens, she whispers. Maybe they learned the same lesson long ago? The sound fades into the dry air, and for a moment the plateau feels like a workshop where the wind keeps the hours. Night settles over the geyser plateau and the air cools by a few careful degrees. The wind drops low, sand quiets around your shoes. Stars press through the haze one by one until their pattern hardens, and the three pyramids start to feel less like buildings and more like arrows. They point to cardinal directions with a precision that reads like a measurement, not a guess. Their bases sit so square to true north that the error feels like a breath miscounted, 3/66 of a degree, and the layout on the ground echoes a streak of 3 stars that crosses the sky in a slanted row. You don't need to be told which row, your eyes find it the way a finger finds a pulse. A guide runs his hand along a limestone casing block, its edge worn smooth by centuries of grit. He keeps a small notebook tucked into his jacket. On one page he has penciled a simple ratio, base perimeter divided by twice the height. He taps the numbers and gives a small, knowing nod. He doesn't say the constant, he lets the math sit there and warm the page. Another line marks a slope that turns into a familiar golden proportion when you compare height to half the base. He looks out across the darkness and mentions almost softly that the monument sits near the balance point of Earth's land masses. Feels less like trivia and more like intent. The pattern tilts in the starlight and its meaning sharpens. Half a world away, a night watchman at Teotihuacan walks the Avenue of the Dead with a thermos under his arm. He pauses, breath smudging the cool air, and watches the Pleiades drop toward the horizon on an equinox evening. The Longstone Road is not simply a road. It lines up with the setting of that cluster in a way that turns architecture into a sky tool. Across the ocean in Cambodia, a temple caretaker at Angkor paces the causeways before dawn bare feet on slick stone. The temple grid around him traces a pattern that scholars compare to a curled dragon of stars. It maps a snake of the north, the body of Draco, onto land and water. The same quiet grammar appears in each place, as if builders spoke one geometric language in different accents. Software can lay the heavens back across the ages, and when it does, a strange thing happens. The monuments lock into the sky of a deep past, not the sky above us now. Alignments fit an epoch around 10,500 BCE with a crispness that starts to feel deliberate. Some whisper that this points to a blueprint handed down, a memory of a time before memory, a construction schedule set for a sky only seen by ancestors of ancestors. Critics counter that humans are good at pattern finding, and that many alignments can be forced if you try hard enough. The map doesn't settle the argument, it just sits there, stubborn, matching stones to older star positions with unnerving ease. In a small dome built centuries after the pyramids, Mayan watchers tracked Venus with a patience that borders on obsession. Their records caught the morning star's cycle to fractions of a day, and they folded those counts into calendars that still make modern astronomers nod. In a dry basin far from the Nile, Nabta Playa holds a ring of stones that catch solstice sun with a farmer's economy. Their arrangement is simple, but the timing shows care for the long swing of the seasons. On a cold plain in Britain, tall stones lift out of chalk and pull the year into a circle you can walk. You stand in one ring, you stand in them all. The function hums across oceans, watch the sky, fix the year, pass it forward. The earth wobbles like a slow top, and that wobble takes about 26,000 years to work through. Precession draws constellations across the horizon inch by inch, so slowly that no one person could measure it alone without clocks, notes, and generations of witnesses. Yet clues to that wobble appear in counting systems tied to 72-year steps and 360-degree circles. They flow through stones that face sunrise points shifting grain by grain, and through carvings that seem to mark stars where they were long ago. Supporters suggest these sites carry fragments of a precession lesson, designed to outlast storms, wars, and language itself. Others dismiss that as clever hindsight. The sky keeps turning either way. A pilot drifts above Peru on a pale morning and sees lines gather under the wing. At first they look like random groove marks, then they snap into long runways and trapezoids, radiating hubs, aerostraight paths that climb hills and ignore easy terrain. From the ground they are just trenches. From altitude they turn into circuits strung across an empty field. Some whisper they served as a way to hold bearings across long distances before compasses, a giant board to train navigators and preserve longitudes. Critics counter with ritual walks and offerings, a theater for gods and men who needed space to speak to each other. The desert holds both voices without comment, keeping the lines clean under wind that scours everything else. A surveyor sits at a he runs great circle arcs through Giza, Teotihuacan, Angkor, and a dozen other points. Some arcs cross with angles that recur more than chance would suggest, repeating separations that look like a rhythm rather than noise. Notes pile up with numbers that favor base 60 steps, the same family that counts out hours and degrees. There's a hypothesis that monuments encode longitude and latitude in this scheme, a coordinated key stamped into stone. He doesn't claim proof, he marks pattern in the margin and turns the globe again. This pulls the question wide. If these alignments form more than local calendars, then what do they become together? Supporters suggest they build a planetary memory, not memory in words, which rot, or in metals which rust. Memory laid in geometry, which can be read after houses fall and tongues change. Sites as anchors in time, cosmic clocks that point to reset points after disaster, telling survivors when to plant again, when to watch the sky for returning seasons, when to mark the start of a new count. The idea is gentle, almost parental. Build with stone, fold in the numbers, let your grandchildren's grandchildren find it in the dust. Back on the plateau, starlight sits on the pyramid faces the way frost sits on grass. The north-south line is so exact it feels like a plumb line dropped from the sky itself. The ratio between the base and the height reads like a quiet joke written in a universal language. You can stand at a corner and feel, in a bodily way, that this is more than a tomb or a pile of blocks. It acts like a coordinate within a larger web, the way a lighthouse becomes part of a chain. You listen and the desert offers only its dry breath. The stones hold their orientation like a compass that cannot lie. A caretaker at anchor sets a small oil lamp on a ledge and steps back, watching the flames stand still in air that has finally cooled. He tilts his head and traces an invisible curve overhead, connecting temple towers with stars they echo. It is an old habit. He learned it from his father, who learned it from a monk, who learned it from a visitor with a transit the color of brass 30 years before. No one says the word grid, but the mind's eye draws one anyway. It runs across seas without cables, linking nodes by sight lines and seasonal events. If walls fall, the relations remain. An idea can be rebuilt from enough points. A graduate student pulls overlays across a laptop at 2 in the morning. She drags a sky map to 10,500 BCE, clicks the faint axis markers into place, and watches lines on the screen jump into alignment with temple avenues and pyramid angles. Her jaw doesn't drop. She just exhales through her nose and writes down the fit distances and angle errors, because that's what the task needs. Critics counter that any large set of monuments will yield some matches if you try enough dates. She circles the way different sites prefer the same date and leans back. The pattern doesn't prove authorship. Proves a habit of thought. Out in the desert beyond the Nile's reach, a ring of stones watches the sun reach the same edge of the horizon it reaches every year. The day lengthens a hair, then a hair more, and the shadow of one standing stone slides into the notch of another. A herder taps his staff twice and nods. That nod is the point. You make a clock so someone else can also nod at the right moment. Do this at enough points on Earth and you create a net that catches time and holds it steady. That is not grand. It is practical. A small plane banks over Nazca in late afternoon. The light hits shallow trenches so they flash pale, then go dark, then flash again. A pulse with every angle. You can't read them at ground level. You must step away. That's the lesson stitched into the lines. Scale can hide information until you rise. Some whisper that this is the same principle behind aligning monuments with stars. Move far enough in space or in time and meaning resolves. Others dismiss the leap and point to festival routes and water rights. Meanwhile, the lines keep their edges sharp under sun that burns color away. Karl Munch's notion of an earth-spanning code sits on a shelf crowded with theories, some elegant, some messy. The part that lingers is simple. Base 60 math, turning circles into maps, maps into positions, positions into meaning. No authority has stamped this as law. Yet the persistent recurrence of angles and ratios across continents makes people like our kitchen table surveyor keep drawing. He's not trying to win a fight. He's trying to see whether stones we already know can be read in a way we haven't tried enough. Think of geometry here as a storage medium. It's less fragile than ink, less tempting to melt down than metal. It survives sand, rain, conquest, boredom, can point through catastrophe. If builders understood long cycles, including the slow wobble that shifts the sky's backdrop, they could set markers to tell future eyes where they stand in that long swing. A civilization might fall, but a line aimed at true north does not. A temple's corridor that catches equinox sun will do so until the corridor collapses, and if it collapses, its foundation still remembers which way it faced. A cold breath moves over the plateau and the first color of dawn brushes the horizon. Birds start faintly near the river. The Sphinx sits to the east as if waiting for the same moment every year. Sun breaks low and lands square between its paws on the spring equinox, and for a few heartbeats the old alignment wakes fully. In that light the question becomes simple. These were not built to please stars. They were built to steady us against them. The message feels less like worship than a note pinned to the future. Look up, count, begin again. The glow thins today as the last stars fade and the alignments retreat into daylight's glare where tourists will see shapes, not bearings. But they are still there, running under the bright chatter like a hidden track. We will carry those lines with us as we turn from the open sky to what lies below. Beneath deserts and ice and forest floors, a different kind of geometry waits, not in towers or avenues, but in grids and channels folded into the ground. Desert wind rattles the dish array as a NASA technician narrows her eyes and fine-tunes the gain. On her monitor, the dunes lose their soft curves and reveal something angular beneath. parallel bands that hold straight for miles then intersect at right angles as if a draftsman drew them with a steady hand. She leans closer. The air in the trailer smells like heated dust and plastic. The faint ozone trace of electronics under load. Outside, sand schemes the ground like smoke. Inside, the grid sharpens. Ground-penetrating radar and LiDAR have been sweeping North Africa for years, and the returns don't only show rivers long gone. They show maps, straight lineations layered over braided channels, rectangles nested inside rectangles, and lattices that repeat in predictable intervals. In some sectors, the ghosts mimic dry deltas, their fans fanning outward into old basins. In other sectors, they run dead straight across subtle rises, ignoring the role of the buried landscape the way roads ignore hills. Algorithms trained to spot ruins in jungles flag these as high-probability cultural features. A human glances and shrugs. The software insists that's where the fight begins. Geologists stamp the label paleochannels and file the images under hydrology. Pattern recognition models push back, marking junctions spaced like intersections and grids that hold consistent cell sizes across dozens of kilometers. Riverbeds wander and meander. These lines hold. The technician bites the inside of her cheek, toggles between false color layers, and watches the markers blink. Blue for watercourses, red for rectilinear anomalies. It looks like two stories laid atop one another, nature beneath and a plan above. Over on the Arabian Peninsula, the air holds the smell of sulfur near old volcanic fields. From a small plane at dawn, an archaeologist runs a finger along the window to trace massive stone shapes that sprawl across the basalt. Long converging walls that open into pens. These are desert kites, and there are more than 10,000 of them mapped from the air. Some edge toward 9,000 years in age. Their scale only makes sense from height, like instructions written to be read by birds. From the ground, you see only stones and heat shimmer. From above, you see geometry with intention. Those kites rattle assumptions. Nomads, we're told, lacked permanence and planning. Yet the lines converge with the exactness of survey work. Some align with seasonal sunrise points. Others seem keyed to topographic funnels only a mapper would notice. The forms echo outward like a grid learning to breathe, and they link across valleys as if someone sketched a supply chain without roads. Critics counter that these were corrals for hunting. Nothing more. Supporters suggest the precision hints at a broader system. A way of organizing landscape when paper and ink were still dreams. The same tools lifting secrets from sand have changed what we thought we knew about forests. LiDAR pulses over Cambodia peeled the canopy away and revealed Angkor's full spine. Roads, ponds, neighborhoods. An urban sprawl stitched neatly around temple cores. Across the Atlantic, laser scans over the Amazon trace causeways and mounds into patterns that read like city planning. Grids, plazas, straight raised roads bridging floodplains that swallow trails every wet season. The revelation isn't the jungle's mystery. It's that our instruments keep finding straight lines where we expected none. The map expands by subtraction. Remove the leaves or the dunes and the lines remain. Back in the Western Sahara, a researcher sits at a second-hand workstation, tabs open to open-source imagery. She adjusts contrast and sees something that makes her hand freeze on the mouse. A cellular field of hexagons, each the size of a town, unfurls for dozens of miles under varnished sand. The shapes lock together like a honeycomb, but their edges are too consistent for salt polygon cracking, and the cells hold size so well that even the algorithm's error bars look embarrassed. She flips between radar and optical layers. No surface hint. Only the ghost below, regular and quiet. Salt deposits don't usually arrange themselves like this at that scale. The polygons that form in lake beds crack and drift, leaving broken seams. This array keeps its posture. She sketches a ring around the formation, then another around a cluster of linear anomalies that run into it like conduits. Pattern wants to be named. She doesn't name it. She writes a timestamp in the margin and sends a cautious note to a colleague. See attached. Curious structure. Could be nothing. Curiosity is a safer word than hypothesis when your dataset looks like a blueprint. In the far south, the air burns your lungs dry, and the horizon blurs into white. Under the ice, radar arrays bounce signals down through miles of blue. The returns climb up the feed. Mountain chains that no eye has seen. Circular forms that repeat with suspicious regularity. And heat signatures that pool under thick cover like coals in an oven. The official gloss leans toward geothermal activity, volcanic plumbing, and the quirkiness of flowing ice. Some whisper that regular circles and steady hotspots might indicate something shaped. Others dismiss that as wishful thinking projected onto a continent that devours stories. The ice isn't talking. The instruments are. Tie all of this to the Sahara grid and the Arabian kites and the jungle roadbeds, and a wider picture flickers. Above ground, we've walked the obvious stones, temples, mounds, plazas. Below ground, the scans imply a second anatomy, one that doesn't care about the weather or time's abrasion. If monumental architecture is the skin, these buried lines might be the nerves, roots, channels, foundations for signals or flow. The idea isn't proven. It's a draft on a table crowded with maps. But draft can reveal the hand that drew them. Look closely at the cadence of the anomalies. In North Africa, the rectilinear grids keep uniform spacing even where buried dunes slump. In Arabia, kite tails aim toward natural corridors. In the Amazon, causeways connect high ground in linear chains that repeat every few miles. These aren't one-off quirks. They rhyme. When different landscapes echo the same geometries, the mind tilts toward intent. Not certainty. Intent. The technician back in the trailer toggles a transparency slider and watches a lattice appear under a river fan. The two fit like a palimpsest. There's a practical dilemma cutting through the romance. Funding favors the agreeable answer. If it's hydrology, you get a nod and a stamp. If it's infrastructure without known culture to attribute it to, the room gets cold. The machine learning models don't mind office politics. They score edges and intersections. They spit out confidence levels. A number on a screen carries no fear. Person does. So a quiet consensus grows, label first, question later. Still, the grids keep surfacing in review files with names like anomaly43.tif and recsetwest.tif. Their straight edges stubborn and neat. Saudi pilots who ferry scientists over lava fields tell small stories. One remembers a chain of kites so long the walls fell out of sight, each funnel pointing to a basin where ancient water would have gathered after rare storms. Another mentions lines cut across stone so weathered they rid like scars. No one on the ground would ever plan at that scale without an eye in the sky. Yet the builders did, or else learned geometry. When archaeology depends on altitude to understand itself, it hints that the design is built for an elevated viewer. Push the scale further out. Global, not regional. Above-ground monuments whisper to stars. Below-ground networks, if that's what we're seeing, might whisper to one another. If sacred sites fall on great circle arcs, perhaps what ties them isn't only sightlines, but buried veins that carried something. Water, people, signal, charge. The thought is speculative. It's also oddly practical. Engineers today bury the good stuff. Cables, pipes, conduits. If you wanted your work to outlast weather, you'd do the same. Sand preserves what wind erases. A field team camps at the edge of dunes where the day's heat still radiates like a low stove. After sundown, they switch on a small portable radar unit. The first sweeps return nothing but noise. The second sweep catches a faint line, then a pair, then a ladder of rungs set into ground that looks uniform from the surface. Someone sets a mug down on a crate and kneels. You can feel the temperature drop as the night pulls the day away. The latter extends past their array's range. In the notebook, the tech writes, regular spacing approximately 40 meters. Orientation 0-35 degrees. On the laptop, the constellation of points builds. Above, the stars show their own lattice. The pattern overlays in the mind without effort. A grid below, a grid above. The temptation is to draw lines between them and claim identity. That's too clean. But the visual rhyme is hard to ignore. The team marks a handful of spots with flags that twitch in the breeze. In the morning, they'll walk the flagged line and find nothing but sand for their trouble. The file will carry the evidence instead, a ghost that fits only in a waveform. Back at the trailer, the NASA technician listens to the fans in the rack. The machine room's warmth makes the air feel close. She pulls a headset down around her neck, rubs one temple, and returns to the map of the Western Sahara. The hexagonal field sits like a sleeping city, edges faint and crisp at once. She expands a subset where the cells distort along one margin, bending around something like an old shoreline. If it's natural, it's a natural with the manners of a planner. If it's not, then someone drew at a scale that implies a different daily life entirely. Across formats and continents, SAR, LIDAR, GPR, the story echoes. Remove what hides the earth and you find order below. Sometimes the order is ecology in time-lapse. Sometimes it looks like habit turned into structure. We can say the safer thing, that erosion writes its own clean lines given enough patience. We can also admit that some patterns, when pressed, push back and ask to be named. Where grids persist across shifting sands, they feel less like accidents and more like memory. Some whisper about communication lines stretched across a world, not for speech, but for synchrony. Others dismiss that as romantic mapping of modern dreams onto ancient ground. Between the whispers and the dismissal is a row of straight edges that no one saw until the sensors learned to see through sand. The debate will live in journals for years. The night offers a different court. Under starlight, the dunes breathe and the buried lines glow in false color on screens that hum softly in the dark. If monuments above ground speak in stone, perhaps the deeper language hid below where wind has fewer words. The maps hint at a dual design, sky-facing markers and earth-hidden frameworks, two halves of a system that once tied place to place. Whether it moved water or people or signals we don't yet know. But the diagrams underfoot and the constellations overhead form a call and response that is hard to ignore. In the small hours, as the generators settle into a steady rhythm, the radar returns slow and steady. The grid completes one more square, then another. The technician presses the headset closer to catch a colleague's voice on a weak channel. Outside, the sky clears and the Milky Way stands out like chalk dust. The screens show faint straight lines and the stars answer with their own. The two patterns mirror and the thought lands gently. The architects might have designed for both realms, heavens above, corridors below. The beam swings south and the storyline pivots toward the first teachers who stepped into the light after the waters fell. Floodwater drains from terraces that once held crops, leaving mud that smells of clay and ash. Smoke threads the sky from broken ridgelines, a faint gray veil against a washed-out sun. At the edge of a lake high in the Andes, footprints press into wet ground and a child holds fast to a parent's sleeve as a figure steps from the water with a light in his hands. Not fire, not lightning. A glow that the old ones will later describe using the nearest words they have. Starlight trapped in tools. Across far coasts, the first dry nights after the deluge carry the same kind of stories. People gather around low flames and speak of beings who came when the rivers ran wild and the stars seemed to move. Some whisper that they taught how to make straight furrows and align stones to the sky. Others say they simply showed how to count the days until the next safe harvest. Names shift with languages, but the role repeats with uncanny steadiness. Teachers arriving after the water, knowledge handed like bread to hands not yet steady. You can trace the pattern continent by continent. In Andean towns near the cold mirror of Lake Titicaca, the tale begins at dawn. Viracocha rises from sacred water with tools that flash at the first light, then walks among people and sets down rules for stone, for stars, for keeping measure. In the valley lands of Mesopotamia, Juans climbs from the sea in a skin that looks like a fish. He does not rule, he instructs. Grain, writing, city order. In the river country of Egypt, a figure linked to writing and wisdom, Thoth, carries scripts and cycles. In the highlands and coasts of Mesoamerica, a feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, appears after ruin to give calendars, arts, and the calm of the good numbers. Critics counter that this symmetry can arise from shared needs, yet the timing in these tales leans toward a recovery phase, as if they remember a restart rather than a first start. The Andean account holds details that cling to the senses. A mason in a windbreak repeats what his grandmother told him. Viracocha's tools gleamed like cold dawn on metal, and the sound they made was a low hum that settled in the ribs. He showed how to shape blocks so they leaned into one another like friends, and how to read the night by counting the small drift of stars slow as a breath. Then he walked west, past reeds and bright water, until sea spray took his steps. A fisherman, standing in shallows, raised a hand as if to ask one more question, but the shore answered only with the soft slap of the waves. In research labs far from those lakes and deserts, charts map a different echo of the same window in time. Between 9,500 and 8,000 BCE, there is a cluster of firsts. Agriculture appears in more than one place, pottery thickens and fires to harder tones. Stones rise in lines that hold the seasons. Supporters suggest genetic drift and settlement patterns, hint at groups stabilizing in the wake of climate swings, then sharing techniques in bursts. The curve looks less like a slow ramp and more like steps, as if people climbed to plateaus of skill and paused before the next rise. A curious thread ties those plateaus to math that feels older than the classrooms we know. The 360-degree circle shows up in cultures with no clear link. Base 60 counting systems appear in early records, and sun-moon calendars keep steady time through complicated cycles. Some whisper these constants form a knowledge package, a toolkit for building not just walls, but agreement about time and space. The puzzle is not that people learned math. It's that the same shapes and numbers seem to arrive with a little ramp-up, as if retrieved rather than discovered. Oral lore can carry weight like stone if repeated with care. In a dry valley, a storyteller draws a serpent eating its tail, the Ouroboros, and says it marks cycles that outlast lifetimes. He taps the sand at intervals and speaks of slow wobbles in the sky's axis that only careful watchers can trace. Are these modern projections onto old symbols? Perhaps. Yet the match between these stories and long cycles feels close enough to ask whether memory can encode astronomy without charts. Some elders point out that the best way to keep knowledge is to bind it to a story people want to say aloud, over and over until the numbers hide in the rhythm. On the ground after a flood, blueprints rarely survive, but habits do. A small band arrives at a new river and places a row of stones that catch morning light at the same angle each day. They count to 360 because their teachers did. They split time into 60s because it divides well and harmonizes with the sky they learned. Children sit and trace the path of the sun on the ground, then tie knots to mark the seasons. Nothing in their hands proves where the knowledge came from, yet their methods carry a feel, a fitted set of parts that lock together like carved joints. This is where timing matters. If water rose and coastline shifted, the places where knowledge was dense would be the first to drown. Shore towns are easy to find, easy to trade with, and easy to lose. Survivors would walk inland with what they could remember, not what they could carry. A woman who once used star tables might now carve in bone to hold a number. A man who once tuned a water channel to sing might now teach how to stack stones so the wind does not knock them down. The record would show an odd rise. Sophisticated tricks without the bulk of a city to explain them. The old names might then slip into the shape of gods. To a village that knows only reeds and river mud, a person who arrives speaking of cycles that take lifetimes to complete would seem more than human. If he carries a light that does not burn his hand, or a tool that vibrates in a way they do not understand, stories will grow around him that stretch beyond the ordinary. Others dismiss this as retrofitting myth to fit modern dreams. Yet the pattern of teacher figures arriving after has a steadiness that nudges the mind to at least test the idea. If you follow that idea, a picture comes into focus. These were not sky spirits. They were human teachers, refugees of a world that lost its coastlines and its centers. Their gifts were not thunder or gold, but frameworks. How to lay out a field, how to read the sky as calendar, how to measure angles in a way that lets a wall stand at the right pitch. The blueprints they carried lived in memory, not on paper. They taught not just skills but repetition. The key to holding a pattern through hungry winters and long walks. Meanwhile, over that same time band, different regions launched into their own bursts of building and making. Near river bends, tall mounds rose. In dry basins, aligned post holes traced the sunrise. In valleys, clay hardened into patterned vessels. None of this proves a single mother culture. It does, however, make the idea of coordinated seeding less far-fetched. Supporters suggest that a few skilled groups can set a region on a faster path by sharing aligned methods, the way a single engineer can lift a village's bridges from guesswork to rules. Little by little a toolkit spreads, and with it the sense that this is how we do it holds firm. Back at Titicaca's shore, there is a way the Viracocha tale ends that always feels oddly modern. After teaching, he walks west, not up into the mountains where people could follow, but toward the horizon where the world falls away. People watch until the glare on the water swallows him. Later, men will carve this moment into stone. The chisel lines are simple: a figure with a staff, a wave folded into a line, a face set toward the place where the sun sinks. If you sit there at dusk, gulls cry and the air chills your hands, you can almost feel the pull to keep walking. In the reed towns of Mesopotamia, the On's tale lingers with a different texture. He comes daily from the water, teaches in daylight and returns to the deep at night. Knowledge in daylight, mystery by night. If you pull that thread across oceans, it matches a rhythm cultures keep. Treat the calendar as both practical and sacred. Use numbers as both measure and song. Everyone needs to know when the river will flood. Not everyone needs to know the deeper cycles, but those who tend the temples hold them like a second map. Egypt's story of a wisdom bearer focuses less on arrival and more on preservation. Scripts and counts anchor society so the Nile's moods do not scatter memory. In Mesoamerica, the teacher's mask changes shape, yet the gift repeats. The calendar locks to Venus and the sun. Architecture takes instruction from the sky. Festivals step to counts that interlock like gears. Critics counter that these are the marks of any growing culture that watches and records. That is fair. But the convergence of counts and constants, 316 base 16 nested cycles, reads like a signature passed hand to hand. A field worker kneels by a hearth pit at a dry dig and flips a shard. The clay shows impressed lines at steady intervals. Not art. A grid. She jots a note. In her pocket is a small card with counts she learned from elders who keep a lunar calendar. She aligns the shard to the card and finds the ratio sits close. Could be chance. Or maybe this is how a package survives. In small matches that repeat across miles until the pattern feels like an old friend, you can feel the pull to turn this into a single neat story. A starship lands. A god speaks. The world resets. That would be easy. The slower tale fits the ground better. Boats ride coastlines. Families carry habits more stubborn than heirlooms. Teachers show up where there is time to listen and leave before the next flood or feud. Over a few hundred years, the teachings become culture. The names turn to myth, yet the methods keep showing up. A circle cut into 360 steps. A way to count by 60s. A habit of watching the sky for the long cycles. Late one night at a lakeside school, a visiting astronomer powers a small device. A thin green beam climbs into air that smells of wet reeds and diesel. Children lean back on their jackets and trace the beam to a familiar pattern. He points and speaks softly about the turning of the world and how some people long ago might have known this by heart. He doesn't say gods. He doesn't need to. The stars settle into place like seeds in rows, and the children follow the lines with their fingers. He lowers the laser and lets the dark return. Somewhere beyond the far shore, the path Viracocha walked meets a highway, an airstrip, a cargo route that hums with our age's own toolkit. The beam leaves no mark on the sky. The stories leave no mark on the lake. But the feeling that someone once stood here and taught by starlight does not fade. And if lessons arrive after ruin as surely as water seeks low ground, the next question waits just beyond the reeds, where the world we build reflects the one we remember. City lights thread across the night like nerves under skin, a slow glitter that maps highways, ports and towers in thin lines of gold. From orbit, the continents look stitched together by electricity. Every bright cluster marks a hub where signals move, data flows, and cargo changes hands. The dark zones between them feel like ancient seas, the kind that swallow ships and stories. You can almost hear the faint buzz of power, a low chorus that says we've learned to draw straight lines across oceans and deserts. Down on the ground, the air tastes like rain on concrete and warm copper near a substation fence. You pass a utility worker with a thermos tucked under his arm and a voltage tester clipped to his belt. He taps a panel, listens with his fingers and nods. The grid hums without drama. Fiber runs underfoot through a manhole lid stamped with a city seal. Satellites will above, each one timed to a heartbeat none of us feel, but all of us depend on. We are surrounded by tools we rarely see, just as we study ruins whose logic we strain to read. We lay cables across the seafloor as if tracing old trade winds with glass threads. We mount dishes on rooftops so signals can leap like sparks to the next block, then to the next town, then to another hemisphere entirely. The pattern echoes something older, roads to markets, canals through plains, alignments that tethered stone to the sky. Supporters suggest the rhyme is not an accident, that societies drift toward grids because grids keep memory alive. Critics counter that it's simply efficiency dressed up as poetry. Either way, the shape repeats. One flare from the sun could bend that shape. It would start as a ripple in the magnetosphere, then a surge in transformers that carry our breathless hours. Archives would wink out in rows, not with a bang, but with a soft electronic sigh. Consider a heat wave stacked with a drought, or a jet stream stuck in a pattern that starves a coastline. Control rooms rely on stable inputs, so do server farms, so did caravan routes threading through predictable springs. When the pattern shifts, the system shows its seams. The long record under our feet tells a quiet story of weather that turns. Around 10,000 years ago, green lands hardened into dust across North Africa. Rivers that once held fish turned to braided scars in the earth. Valleys carved by glaciers were left raw, then swallowed by rising seas. Some whisper that these transitions did more than move tribes. They erased libraries that never had a chance to rot, because they were never made of paper. A changed wind can do what war cannot. Volcanic ash still lies in thin gray bands across fields and lakebeds, a flat line that marks a season when the sun dimmed. Long before our grids, those bands cut off harvests and rerouted families. Today we watch thermal maps bloom on screens, red spreading where reservoirs shrink and blue fading where forests fall. The imagery feels clinical until you notice how it overlaps with the places most wired, most complex, most sure of themselves. The math of collapse does not shout, it ticks. A satellite passes over the Amazon and sees a mosaic. Patches of heat show cleared land. Winding lines trace new roads. The river looks wider in places where banks crumbled after a heavy season. None of it is dramatic alone. Together it reads like the first page of a story we've seen before written in different ink. Our senses are better now. Our reach is wider. That does not make us immune. It makes the map sharper. On a tide flat at low water, you stoop to turn a shard of glass with a finger. It's green and frosted, rolled for years in waves. You slip it in your pocket. Someone someday might do the same with a fragment of our towers. They could find alloy flakes fused into river clay, a crushed lens beside a fossilized rat's nest of wire. They might read the sediments of New York like layered code and ask what we were saying when the power went quiet. Supporters suggest that the future archaeologist would see our precision and assume we met something bigger than ourselves. Others dismiss that as romantic, but we know the vulnerability is real. The internet needs stable cooling and steady generation. A shipping lane requires tolerance in the weather window. A phone call depends on satellites timed to the microsecond. The more tightly tuned the system, the more a small wobble ripples through everything it touches. An ice core sliced in a cold lab reveals how fast a climate can lurch. One band is thick, then the next is thin. The change is abrupt enough to mark a human life. We like to think progress climbs in a straight line, but the record edges like a saw. It leaps. It stalls. Civilizations tend to ride the smooth parts. They falter on the teeth. In earlier ages, a stalled monsoon turned fertile fields into memory. Today, a stalled current could turn a data center into a dark box with warm air and locked doors. A bridge trembles under trains and wind. Engineers scan it with lasers and find stress patterns they model and then correct. Elsewhere, a levee shows seep lines during a king tide. We fix, shift, brace, and even move houses when the water insists. The work feels endless because it is. It's the same labor that once kept canals clear and terraces stable. We like to rename tasks to feel new, but the tasks themselves endure. This orbit of dependence ties us to strangers. A farmer in one state grows grain that runs through a mill 3 borders away, then rides a ship to a city you'll never see. The ship navigates by satellite and port signal. A flare could drop both for a day. The captain would hold in the roadstead and watch the swell. A day becomes a week. The food moves late. Then the factory shifts orders like beads on a string. The chain makes a sound you don't usually hear. It's thin, but it sings. Sometimes a pattern grows so large that it hides in plain sight. A map of subsea cables looks like a nervous system. A map of airline routes looks like a set of wings. A map of soil moisture reads like a slow breath. The overlay is not comforting. It shows how much of our balance depends on whether that stays inside a narrow range. It also shows how we crave predictability and how we build to it without admitting that we do. There's a soft irony in the fact that we use satellites to watch the edges of drought creep across farms that supply the metals for the satellites. Thermal imaging lights up forest loss like a bruise. Sea level maps paint coastlines with lines where future water rests. The colors are accurate and clean. If the screen flickered out, the coast would still rise. Technologies wear different skins over time, but their bodies look alike. Caravan tracks become roads. Roads become rails. Rails become flight paths. Sea lanes and fiber follow the same seabed contours. In both eras, storms force detours. Pirates change shape but remain pirates. Fees at the choke points collect under new names. Our dashboards have more digits, yet the game repeats over a longer table. If you freeze the globe and pull back to the lunar view, the cities turn to a soft haze. The dark between them expands. You don't see wires, towers, or undersea knots of glass. You see a lit rim on a wheel that has spun for billions of years without noticing who climbed it. The calm is absolute. It's unnerving. It makes our plans feel like notes pinned to a door that could blow open with one gust. So maybe the measure isn't height at all. Maybe it's half-life. How long a method lasts. How often our people teach their descendants where the fault lines run and where the water went last time. Advancement in this light sounds less like push and more like memory. Less like a sprint and more like knowing how to walk back after the hillsides. A quiet laboratory calibrates a magnetometer. Equal parts patience and repetition. In another room, a librarian catalogs data tapes from a weather satellite now retired. The tape labels look mundane. Year, day, past number. They're a time machine. They record the first hints of trends that matter far more than a minister's speech. If our era leaves anything that endures, it might be this habit of watching the sky and taking notes. Of course, we design for redundancy. Backup generators, microgrids, caches underground, mirrored servers in distant regions. We split the risk so a single cut won't bleed us out. The strategy is sound, yet it rests on the same assumption as any terrace, that the season will come like it did last year. When it does not, redundancy becomes a bridge to a place we didn't plan to inhabit. There's a worker on a night shift at a hydropower station. He steps out to feel the temperature and smell the river. He can tell when the snow melts is late by the way the mist sticks to his face. It's a simple check that no sensor quite replaces. Human senses, humble as they are, still close loops in complex systems. That too is a pattern we inherit from ancestors who judged a storm by the pressure in their teeth. If we do fall, the first thing to fade may not be steel. It will be lore. The handoff between generations is a fragile ritual. Lose a few links and a practice can vanish in a season. That is why old societies carved warnings into calendars and stones. We shove ours into code and cloud keys. Both can crack. Both can survive if tended. We find it hard to hold two truths at once. That we are capable of real marvels and that those marvels stand on the narrow ridge of climate, geology, and luck. That ridge has held for a while. It has tilted before. Our maps show both the marvel and the ridge. They glow together on the same screen. The view from the moon does not applaud or scold. It shows a planet with scars and fresh paint. A soft sheen where cities trace a lattice that might pass like dew. Under those lights are people trying to keep warm, boil water, charge phones, and trust a network that makes a day feel normal. So much depends on normal. If the pattern from older ages echoes in ours, the question grows simple and heavy. Do we learn to fold memory into the build itself so knowledge outlives hardware? Or do we trust the grid to carry memory until the grid stumbles? The answer matters more than height or speed, because speed without recall is a bright flare, then a cooled cinder. The orbit holds its path, indifferent and steady. Earth turns and the bright web brightens with nightfall again. It looks calm from there, the kind of calm that tempts you to think it will always be this way. The last time the world felt this sure, terraces stood where dunes now move. The frame widens and the lights thin to a faint veil across a blue sphere. We've been here a long moment. The next section of the map waits in the dark, where our sensors keep catching straight lines we nearly miss. The drone steadies against a crosswind as its camera tilts. Below, reefs near Okinawa show their pale bones. Then a shape breaks the blue. Squared edges, a right angle longer than a city bus, a shadow where coral should twist and wander. The pilot pinches the screen to zoom. Silt whispers in little flares behind the propellers. Blocks appear in a checker, too tidy, too deliberate, laid out where fish drift like street traffic. He marks a waypoint without speaking. The battery warning ticks in his ear as if to say, That's enough. Leave it be. Across the world, satellites graze Earth with a soft electronic stare. Their mission is weather, ice thickness, melt season length, the long pulse of storm tracks. Yet the scans keep returning shapes that do not map cleanly. Under Antarctic ice, the grayscale turns from smooth to ruled. Bands and rectangles in repeating intervals, like someone scored the bedrock with a giant carpenter's square before the snow sealed it. In a dusty office near a copper mine, a surveyor toggles layers, and 50 meters down, the rock shows paired channels 6 inches wide, running on a straight track for half a mile. He runs a fingertip along the printout and doesn't write the word tool in the margin, he just draws a thinner line. What happens next is a tone shift. A meeting room fills. Papers slide. The phrases arrive. Geomorphology, jointing planes, natural fracture sets, each a way to close the folder and move the budget. People mean well. They have schedules and careers. Others dismiss anything that messes with tidy charts. Some whisper that funding goes quiet when the lines make too much sense. A few lab groups report their radar archives locked down for national security reasons. No one angry, just tired. The drone pilot in Okinawa learns to stop volunteering extra footage. He names the square shadow after the boat he flies from and pushes the memory down with the rest. In the cold south, a technician sits in the hum of a polar station, watching a slab of data build on her monitors. Electromagnetic pulses slip into ice 2 miles thick. She sips from a mug that always tastes like metal. The return signal looks like floodplain at first, then her eyes adjust. The reflectors come back in ticks that space themselves too evenly. Not dunes, not bedded rock. Arrays. She runs the filter again. The pattern holds and throws a faint grid. It could be geothermal tubing in a wall of frozen time. Could be structure. She prints a single frame and folds it into her pocket. Later, she holds it up to the clear pale window and thinks the ice seems to be holding its breath. Deep in older stone, miners around the world haul out surprise shapes that the news never loves. Bedrock opens on channels that keep a tolerance when the ancient frost or groundwater doesn't normally do it in pairs with matching edges and a shallow V for runoff. In the core library, a geologist turns a cylinder of rock that shows a channel like a groove in a record. He writes unknown process and closes the book. The label makes him feel safe the way a coat does in wind. On other evenings, the conversation drifts to strange orbs. In South Africa, inside rock dated far older than bones or bronze, lie small metallic spheres with grooves around their middles. People call them Zamora spheres in rumor circuits. They sit balanced on glass shelves like careful jokes. If they are natural, geology has a trick no one has taught in class. If they are not, time has a trick no one is eager to say out loud. Critics counter that nodules do odd things and layers move under pressure for ages, and that is true often enough to cover many sins. Supporters suggest the grooves were cut, and that is a sentence that goes nowhere near a peer-reviewed page. The spheres sit quietly and do not defend themselves. Above the Nile's bend, a different kind of particle draws lines. Muon tomography, the slow rain of cosmic particles through stone, paints the inside of the Great Pyramid with patient dots. The images reveal cavities that manuals do not discuss. One void sits like a held breath above famous chambers, and the ratios it hints at feel musical to the engineers who stare at the plots. They see harmonics where textbooks show stacked blocks. No one rewrites a syllabus in one winter, so the new rooms turn into polite debates and careful language. The thought that the building could be a tuned instrument is left to late-night walks and quiet murmurs at site boundaries where tourists cannot hear. Elsewhere, lasers brush green canopy. In the Amazon, LiDAR draws lattices where trees hide grid streets. Causeways run straight and disciplined. Waterways kick at right angles and then curve when the land demands it, like a mind thinking through each bend. For decades, Maps wrote the word pristine over these regions. Now the same maps show farmhouse after farmhouse if you imagine time slow enough. In dry seasons, soil lines sing in aerial photographs and the old causeways catch the light like scars that learn to heal straight. People expected anomalies to come as a single revelation. Some neat show and tell that would raise a hand and ask for the floor. Instead, they arrive as a steady drip. A sonar pass in the Caribbean returns cubes not quite random. A desert kite in Arabia shows clean geometry when the angle of the sun throws long shadows. A data set in a mountain lab flags a repeating interval in rock beneath an ice sheet. Each on its own feels like nothing. Together they push at the edges of the timeline until the numbers look thinner. Then we come back to the institutions that keep lights on. A lab goes up for renewal and a panel recommends pivoting to safer topics. A young scientist cleans up language to avoid the word artifact dossiers file under the gentle umbrella of coincidence. People do what people do in every era, protect the work by smoothing its corners. The Okinawa drone pilot sells his footage as stock of reef survey. The polar technician stops printing frames. She does not stop watching. At a field site in scrub country, an archaeologist works a small square of earth. The day warms and the ground smells like iron and sunblock. She lifts a piece of quartz that carries lines that cross with a kind of purpose. Not a flake scar, not a plow. The angles on it do not match any local tradition she knows. She clicks the pen behind her ear and labels a bag. She finds another shard with a matching bite, then a third. She looks up past the trench edge and sees the ground ripple with the suggestion of a larger map. The line in the report she will later write has been said before by others in other fields. We don't lack discoveries. We lack permission to believe what they imply. She doesn't add her voice to any theory. She just keeps digging. There is a rhythm to the way the anomalies appear. Ocean, desert, jungle, ice. The four corners of our present all returning echoes. Some whisper that the machines built for climate and extraction are the same eyes that will make the old world visible. The irony is quiet and a little sharp. We look for one problem and find another, older, sitting under the same data. The maps do not blush. They just accept a new line and hold it steady. In the Antarctic station, the technician compares last year's passes with this year's. The shapes have not moved. That alone argues against some ice artifact. She hears the weather antenna click in the wind and thinks of the under-ice arrays like a city that never thawed. Critics counter with subglacial water pathways and basal freeze-thaw cycles that can stack reflections into honeycombed illusions. She knows the textbook images. They don't quite match the tidiness on her screen. The difference between mostly and exactly is where a career can break. Back in the Amazon, a pilot who once flew tourist hops now charts LiDAR runs. He comes home with a hard drive full of angles. One pass shows a plaza with corners so clean you could rest a coin on them. The next shows an earthen pyramid under vines. The farmers in the village have stories about ancestors who raised fish in canals and lived in houses on islands of mud that never sank. He nods and files the GPS grid. What the data calls mounded earth they call grandmother's house, which seems as valid a label as any. This sea adds its share each month. Off the Indian coast, older shorelines reappear in bathymetric charts as shoulders and terraces now 100 m down. The depths hold the quiet geometry that coasts tend to attract. Ports, piers, straight lines built to serve tides. A sonar tech taps a screen and adjusts gain until the rectangles show more clearly. He knows not to say anything loud. He logs the coordinates and eats a late lunch under a buzzing fluorescent strip. Institutional memory is strong. It remembers bad bets and public embarrassment. It guards its gates sometimes too tightly. But the flow of data in this century is a river that ignores fences. Mining surveys flag precision cuts. Climate satellites pencil in grids under ice. Muons sketch hidden rooms in old stone. Lasers pull cities out of jungles. A drone drifts over a reef and catches a square shadow. None of these were hunting for a lost age. They were just doing the job of measuring a changing world. The question that begins to form has less heat in it than the old arguments. It arrives late at night in labs and cockpits and tents, and it sounds like this. If we keep finding lines that look like the sum of a builder's hand, how long before we allow the timeline to breathe enough to hold them? No ceremony, no manifesto, just a gentle adjustment to where we expect to find the past. The archaeologist with the quartz lays the day's pieces in a row at her table and notes the tolerances with a ruler. They match to a fraction across stones that came from different pits. Could mean many things. Could mean craftsmen who treated stone like a ledger, even if their names are lost. Could point further back than her grant covers. She feels the little pulse of risk that comes with writing a bolder sentence. The Okinawa pilot replays the clip of the reef square on his phone while waiting at dock. The tide smacks wood lazily. The square holds and doesn't dissolve into noise. On some evenings he opens a sea chart and traces where the coast sat when the ocean stood lower by 100 meters. The square sits on what would have been a hill above a river mouth. He shuts the chart and pockets the thought. In the polar station, the technician folds the print again until the paper keeps the crease. She places it between 2 pages of a field notebook. Outside, the wind lifts a fine spray of ice crystals that sting the skin like salt. Inside, the monitor hums with the next pass, a fresh stripe across the bed. The echoes rise, spaced like notes. She tightens her headphones and leans closer, listening for a pattern she isn't yet allowed to name. The stack of anomalies grows across oceans, deserts, forests, and ice. Not with a bang, but with a patient tick. Each one sets a small hook in the mind. Each one asks for room. If the pattern holds and the machines keep seeing what they weren't designed to see, then the old map will have to shift a little. Not to erase what we know, but to open a door toward what we keep overlooking. And if that door opens even a hand's width, the draft from the other side will carry the same faint smell of stone dust and old water that rises when someone brushes a buried edge and finds that it runs on longer than the trench allows. The work will not get louder, it will get clearer. Which is when the next echo, waiting just out of frame, will step forward and ask to be heard. The diver's light sweeps across the same submerged steps, but the edges have softened. Coral plates clutch the corners. Small fish move through doorways like neighbors on a quiet street. Bubbles rise and break against stone that still holds its line even after 1,000 storms. The water feels cooler at depth, and the beam catches a carved groove at the riser, a clean right angle hidden under shell. The hand that made it is long gone. The measure remains, and the scene flips to twilight. Baalbek's terrace cools as the heat drains from the stone, and the air holds dust that tastes faintly of iron. A crane hook hangs still, dwarfed by blocks that own the sunset. Mist lifts at Machu Picchu and curls around terraces cut into the mountain as if the slope itself grew steps for a vanished people. Moonlight bleaches the sand at Giza until the edges look drawn with chalk. Each site looks like a memorial, less a story of power than a quiet reminder that they stood and then they were left behind. You can feel a symmetry stirring, the kind that makes you look from granite to glass, those builders carved in rock. We assemble in code, both reach for order, both live on grids that promise permanence, but code fades if the current cuts. Servers hum until they don't. A blackout is a blunt editing tool, and even stone becomes dust when the clock runs long. Supporters suggest the same drives both eras, shape the world to hold a thought against weather and forgetting. Others dismiss that parallel as poetic, but the rhyme is hard to ignore when a data center door clicks shut with the same ritual pride as a temple gate. Look down from orbit, threads of light race along coasts and river mouths, tracing our routes with a steady glow. Follow those lines and the pattern overlaps old paths. Fiber runs where caravans wore grooves into earth. Subsea cables stitch continental shelves where reed boats once slipped in shallows. Air corridors bend along jet stream lanes that echo the trade winds used by sails. The map repeats itself even as names and materials change. We call it innovation, the ground calls it habit. Across the centuries, curiosity refuses to go quiet. Every culture raised a story of a better place lost to water or time. Atlantis in one tongue, Lemuria in another. Mu, Eden, a golden age, a drowned garden. The names drift, but the shape stays steady. A people knew, a people fell, and a few carried the knowing onward like embers in a clay pot. Some whisper that these tales aren't myth at all, but compressed history told in forms that survive. Critics counter that the human mind loves symmetry and tragedy in equal measure. Either way, the stories endure. So what outlasts the city when stone slumps and code goes cold? Questions seem to cling. Children ask why stars wheel and why seasons turn, and those questions grow into calendars and ziggurats and math scratched into bone. A grandmother tells of a flood, and a grandson learns where to build and where to leave alone. Lore travels better than brick. It lives in voices, changes shape enough to fit new mouths, and carries maps without paper. That is a kind of technology, it just doesn't shine. In the early light, one archaeologist walks a ridge where the dune wind feels like a steady hand on the cheek. Her boot makes a print that holds for a breath and then smooths to nothing. She kneels and finds a shard with a pattern pressed into it. Triangles nested inside triangles, a motif that finds cousins on cloth in another country, and in carvings on a pillar half a world away. The shard warms in her palm. A sandfly spirals in the heat. Somewhere below, a riverbed gone dry curls under the dunes, and there may be walls cut into its banks, or only rocks that tease the eye. She pockets the coordinates and keeps walking, because walks become surveys and surveys turn into maps. That's how the ground tells its slower story. Out in the ocean, tides tug, and long-buried plains lean toward a light they will never see again. Dvarka's steps sit with their silent traffic fish for company. Far to the north, Doggerland sleeps under silt, while trawlers drag up bones and tools like messages snagged by accident. These are the reminders that landscapes shift under our feet, and shorelines redraw themselves without asking. The sea gives and takes. We are tidy tenants with rent that comes due. Under cloudless night, the world shrinks to a soft glow. Cities look like circuits, it feels sturdy from here. Yet a flare from the sun could peel the varnish off our network in less than a day. Floods will redraw river mouths. Ice will come and go as the planet leans. None of that is punishment, it's rhythm. The monuments knew this and stared at the sky to stay in sync. We build apps to do the same. Different tools, same itch to measure the swing and keep time with it. There is a simple lesson in the way maps recur. When new people arrive in old places, they find the same safe harbors, the same passes through stone, the same springs. They set stones where stones sit well. Lines repeat not because someone ordered it, but because the earth gives limited good answers. If a mother tells a daughter not to sleep in a certain valley when the heavy rains come, that advice carries farther than any wall. Memory isn't just a library, it's a path to higher ground. Even the symbols seem to travel. A staff with two snakes twists from Mesopotamia to the edges of the Indus. A trident cuts spray in Greek poems and rests in South Asian hands. Supporters suggest these echoes point to long threads, tugged across oceans by traders and refugees who carried badges of a lost guild. Others dismiss this as convergence, the way separate minds grab the same shapes when they try to tame a world full of water and teeth. Either way, the shapes keep surfacing with a stubborn calm. Back underwater, the diver's gauge ticks down. He moves slower now, not out of fear, but for detail. Algae peels back under a thumb and shows a tooling groove that looks too true for chance. He won't prove anything in a single pass. He'll mark a bearing, log a depth, and send the file later. Someone at a desk will watch the scan glide across a monitor and think about grant money and weather windows and how many days until the boat has to head in. The sea doesn't hurry for us. That may be why it keeps secrets so well. From the ground, each site feels singular. From the air, patterns emerge like steam tracing currents in a room. The same ratios appear in temples you could not walk between in a lifetime. Roads meet at angles that fit the sky at noon on certain days in eras long gone. Paths align with baselines crossed by power lines today. The overlay is messy. It is also stubborn. Pull any thread and the tangle shifts, but it doesn't fall apart. That is the shape of a conversation across ages. The ache that sends us looking hasn't changed. We want to know where we come from, how much we've forgotten, and what we might remember in time. Whether you talk to a mason who sets one more block against a wall or to a coder pushing changes before a release, the hope sounds alike. Make it strong, make it clear, make it last. The honest part comes later, when everyone admits that nothing lasts as long as we hope, but something travels. Often it's the habit of asking. At the edge of a salt flat, wind rattles dry stems and heat shifts like a curtain. An old road strides across the plain because it found good gravel once. A new highway parallels it, smoother, faster, louder. On a clear day, a satellite could watch both and send down a picture where they look like twin lines tightened by the same hand. That view has a way of shrinking the argument. We aren't the first to draw lines. We are, for the moment, the ones holding the pen. Pull away until the globe is a slow coin. You see a few threads of light that mark our current reach. Nothing else gives us away. The deserts keep their patient patterns. The jungles knit over errors. The ice blinks. The stars that the builders watched have shifted a little, then shifted back on their long rhythm. The point is not our absence. It's that we fit inside a cycle that does not mind our timetables. Back on the beach, the diver surfaces into late sun and pulls off his mask. Salt stings a cut on the knuckle, and the air tastes like warm metal and kelp. He leans against the gunwale and looks back at the place where the city would meet the shore if time ran backward. His notes are wet but legible. A small thing to carry towards shore. A small thing that adds to the pile. Across a desert that used to be green, the archaeologist clears a thin layer of sand from a block that holds a line too straight for wind to draw. Her brush taps twice as she clears a corner. The line doesn't argue. She rubs a thumb along the edge and checks the horizon, where heat makes the air ripple. She knows that a gust could fill the trench by evening. She also knows the coordinate is now on 3 separate drives and 2 memories, and 1 notebook with a coffee stain on the cover. That may be enough. Cities flare as night drops, and the planet looks busy and sure. Yet the memory of the water over the steps and the sand over the line sits like a small weight in the chest. These are different faces of the same story. We build. We lose. We remember. Then we try again. If there was an age before ours that held more than we think, its residue would look like this. Patterns that refuse to go away, and questions that refuse to be quiet. Hands brush sand from a perfectly cut stone. The gesture is so simple that it could belong to a temple mason, a field school student, or someone you know picking grit off a windowsill. The camera climbs until the figures shrink to threads in a landscape of wind and water, then higher until the land itself turns to color and curve. The world becomes a pale dot, and with it all the stories we do and don't know yet, spinning in the same steady turn as the lights wink on and off. The next chapter waits at the edge of that turn, just out of frame, where the tide meets the shore one more time. A final thought settles in like low tide at night. If water can cover streets and erase names, then time can cover chapters. The layers don't argue. They lie quietly on top of one another until a lens, a shovel, or a diver's hand breaks the crust. What seemed like empty coast becomes steps. What looked like blank desert becomes a grid. What we thought was myth becomes a map with worn edges. The pattern tilts in the light and its meaning sharpens. You've walked this path with care, weighing the ordinary against the odd, the recorded against the rumored. Some whisper that a deeper past is calling from under silt and ice. Others dismiss the call as pareidolia, lines where none were intended. Both views share one small truth. We only see what our tools allow, and our questions decide where we point them. So here's the gentle test. If traces of an older world rose from the shallows tomorrow, cut stone under kelp, bearings in peat, a plan etched into bedrock, would you recognize them as ours? Would they feel like a warning from kin or an artifact of strangers? The answer might depend less on evidence and more on whether we expect ancestors to think like us, solve problems like us, and leave the same kinds of fingerprints we do. Keep your mind open, but keep your skepticism close. Let the tide run out uncertainty for a moment. The sand will settle again. Thank you so much for watching. See y'all in the next one video. If you like my channel, like and subscribe.